Mr. Whitfield, 9 pilots have already walked out of this room.
Then I guess it's my turn to sit down.
Victoria, there she is. 10 pilots, Mr. Whitfield. 10 in 14 months.
9, sir. 9 left. I'm the 10th.
Miss Caldwell, we have a fault on our fire detection system.
Say the rest.
My recommendation is Anchorage.
He said it wasn't difficult at all. What were you hoping he'd say?
Mr. Whitfield, Gerald Patton said, and his voice had the particular flatness of a man who has repeated something so many times that the words have stopped meaning anything to him. Personally, you do understand that 9 pilots have already walked out of this room. James Whitfield did not move. He did not shift in his chair, did not look at the 8 empty seats arranged around the conference table, did not glance at the coffee cups that still sat at various positions around the room. Some of them half full. All of them cold, left behind by men who had apparently decided that whatever Gerald Patton was about to tell them was not worth finishing their coffee over. James looked at Gerald Patton directly, the way a man looks at another man, when he needs him to understand something without being told twice. Then I guess James said, "It's my turn to sit down." Gerald stared at him for a long moment. Gerald Patton was 60 years old and had been placing corporate aviation pilots for 22 years, which meant he had put men in the cockpits of jets owned by oil executives and tech billionaires and a retired senator who refused to fly over open water, and once memorably, a country music star who insisted the aircraft be stocked with a specific brand of habanero hot sauce that was only manufactured in 2 states. In 22 years, Gerald Whitmore had seen almost everything that the intersection of extreme wealth and private aviation could produce. He had never seen a Thursday morning quite like this one. By 9:47 in the morning, the last of the 9 pilots had pushed his chair back from the long glass table on the 14th floor of Caldwell Aero Systems' downtown Chicago headquarters and walked out without a word of explanation, without a goodbye, without even the courtesy of taking his briefing packet with him. Just the sound of dress shoes on marble flooring and the soft mechanical click of the elevator button, and then silence, and then Gerald Patton alone in a room with 8 cold coffee cups and a clipboard that felt heavier than it had any right to. And then he had looked up, and James Carter was still sitting at the table. He was 41 years old, broad-shouldered in a way that spoke less of the gym and more of years of physical discipline maintained long after the circumstances that required it had passed. And he had a stillness about him that Gerald had noticed from the moment the man walked in and took his seat. Not the stillness of relaxation, the built-in, bone-deep stillness of a man who had spent years in a cockpit, where the difference between calm and panic was the difference between landing and not landing. He had a manila folder on the table in front of him and a paper coffee cup that had gone cold approximately 90 minutes ago, and he had not touched it once. Gerald cleared his throat. "Mr. Whitfield, you understand that this position has been declined by 9 qualified aviators in the past month alone. I know some of those men had significantly more flight hours than I'm aware." James looked at him directly, not aggressively, just directly. "Then surely you understand why I'm asking whether you'd like to take some additional time to." "Mr. Patton," James's voice was the same temperature it had been when he walked in. "I spent 8 years flying combat missions where a wrong decision meant people died. I have landed aircraft in 0 visibility conditions, in mountain crosswinds, with hydraulic failures. Once I took a bird strike that knocked out 40% of Engine 2, and I put that aircraft down at a regional airfield, on a runway that barely qualified as one in the dark on fumes." He paused not for effect, just because he had said everything he needed to say, and saw no reason to add to it. "I am not afraid of this job, and I don't need more time." Gerald stared at him for a long measuring moment. Then he looked down at his clipboard, then back up, and something had shifted almost imperceptibly in his expression. The way something shifts in the expression of a man who has been trying to solve an equation for a month and has just watched someone write the answer on the board without being asked. "The salary is $9,000 a month," he said finally. "Travel allowance and a housing subsidy during extended transit periods." James did not blink. When do I start? But to understand why James Whitfield walked toward that desk instead of the door, the way 9 other men before him had, not you have to go back 72 hours to a kitchen counter in the Woodlawn neighborhood of Chicago, where a man who had exactly $8 in his wallet was awake before the sun and checking job boards the way some men check the weather. The alarm was set for 5, but James was already awake at 4:47, which was how it had been for the past 14 months, his body having made the decision somewhere in the depths of grief that sleep past a certain hour was a luxury it was no longer prepared to offer him without a fight. He made coffee 1 cup, which was a thing he still had to remind himself of, 1 cup, not 2. And he opened his laptop on the kitchen counter and began his morning search, the way he always began it, which was methodically with no steps skipped and with absolutely zero expectation that this particular Tuesday would be different from the Monday before it or the Wednesday before that. He checked 5 job boards in the same order every morning, the same way a pilot checks an aircraft before flight. Not because he expected to find something wrong with the wings, but because the discipline of checking was what kept you alive when something actually was wrong, and you needed your hands to know what to do before your brain caught up. It was the discipline that mattered, not the expectation. Maya was asleep down the hall. He could hear her breathing through the baby monitor he still kept on the counter, even though she was 6 years old, and had informed him twice in the past month that she was in her exact words. "Too old for the baby thing, Daddy." But James had not taken it off the counter, because some habits are not about logic. They are about the particular comfort of knowing at 3 in the morning, when the world feels very large and very quiet, that the person who matters most to you in it is breathing steadily 12 feet away. The kitchen had the particular quality of stillness that all kitchens have at 5 in the morning. But there was something else in this kitchen, something that had settled into the walls over the past 14 months. The way cold settles into a house when the heat has been turned off, a quality of absence that had nothing to do with the season. There were 2 coffee mugs on the shelf above the maker, and James used one of them every morning and left the other one exactly where it was, which was probably something a grief counselor would have something to say about. But James Whitfield had not been to a grief counselor, and did not intend to, because there were certain things a man works through on his own terms, and he understood with the blunt clarity of someone who had spent a decade making hard calls that he was built to be one of those men. He was on the 4th job board when he found it. Private aviation corporate contracts. Seeking experienced private aviation pilot. Minimum 5,000 flight hours, instrument-rated business. Jet type rating preferred. Full-time position based in Chicago with domestic and international travel. Compensation competitive. Client has specific operational requirements. Multiple previous candidates have found this position unsuitable. Serious applicants only. He read it 3 times. Most people reading those words would hear alarm bells. Multiple previous candidates have found this position unsuitable was not a phrase designed to inspire confidence. But James Whitfield did not hear alarm bells. He heard something else entirely. He heard a problem that had so far not found the right person to solve it, which in his experience was a different thing altogether. He called at 7 in the morning. Gerald Patton answered on the 2nd ring, and there was a half-second pause after James gave his name that James noticed and filed away without comment. He told Maya about the interview at dinner that evening, which he had not planned to do. She was 6. She did not need the details of her father's job search, but Sophie had inherited from her mother a deeply unsettling ability to look at him across a table and understand that something had changed in the air of the room, and she had put her fork down and looked at him with her mother's serious brown eyes and said, "Daddy." Did something happen? "I have a job interview Thursday," he said. "Flying job. Private jet for a businesswoman in Chicago." Maya turned this over with the particular gravity she applied to most things. "Is she nice? I don't know yet." "Find out," Maya said, as if this were the most obvious piece of advice in the world, and went back to her dinner. He told her he might be gone some nights, some trips that Mrs. Hutchins next door was always happy to be around, and Maya made a face that was part acceptance and part the ancient weariness of a child who has already learned at 6 years old that the people she loves sometimes have to go places without her, and that this is just the shape of things, even when the shape is hard. She had learned that 14 months ago in the hardest possible classroom. "Okay," she said, "but the good animal crackers, not the store ones." "I'll make it part of the arrangement," James said. Maya nodded, satisfied, and after a moment, without looking up from her plate, she said, "I hope you get the job, Daddy." James looked at his daughter, at her dark hair, and her mother's serious eyes, and the small certainty with which she had just said the most important thing anyone had said to him in over a year, and he felt the familiar ache that lived in his chest, the one that had been there every day for 14 months, the one he had learned to breathe around. The way you learn to breathe around a broken rib, carefully, methodically, never fully forgetting it was there. "Me too, Bug," he said. "Me too." Thursday came cold and gray the way March mornings in Chicago come with a wind off the lake that cuts clean through whatever you're wearing and reminds you that this city was built by people who decided that 40 below was a reason to build better coats, not to go somewhere warmer. James wore his best suit, not because he thought clothes were armor. He was past the age of that particular illusion, but because Victoria Caldwell was a professional, and she deserved to meet one, and showing up in your best suit when you have $8 in your wallet is not a performance. It is a kind of respect. Caldwell Aero Systems headquarters was a glass tower designed to announce permanence, the kind of building that says, "We were here before you, and we will be here after you," in the language of steel and expensive light fixtures. James took the elevator to 14, checked in at reception, gave his name, and sat down to wait. He was there 20 minutes. He used them the way he used all waiting time, which was to observe. The floor plan was wide corridors, generous doorways, built with clearance that exceeded what the building code required. The elevator buttons were positioned lower on the panel than standard. Not dramatically, not in a way that announced itself. Just lower the way something is lower, when whoever designed it was thinking about who would be using it, and decided to let the architecture do the work quietly. There was a ramp built into the lobby floor that rose so gradually and so seamlessly into the surrounding marble that anyone not specifically looking for it would walk right over it without registering what it was. There were no signs for it, no special access markers, no arrows, just a building that had been designed by someone who understood something important to work for everyone without needing to advertise the fact. Dignity. James thought watching a woman in heels walk right over the ramp without glancing down doesn't need a label. Mr. Whitfield, a young man named Thomas, appeared at the edge of the waiting area, moving with the particular efficiency of someone who has learned to treat another person's time as if it were his own oxygen supply, something to be conserved and never wasted. "She's ready for you. She has a call at 10. The office at the end of the hallway had a view of Lake Michigan in the distance, a gray smear of cold water under a grayer sky, and Victoria Caldwell was on the phone when James walked in. She held up one finger without looking at him, finished what sounded to James like the end of a sentence in Japanese, and set the phone down and looked at him. She was exactly 34 years old, and she looked exactly like what she was, which was a woman who had been fighting twice as hard as everyone else in every room she had ever walked into, and had made a decision somewhere along the way to stop finding that unusual. Her jacket was precise. Her posture was deliberate. Her wheelchair was low profile and clearly well chosen. Not the kind that announces itself, but the kind that simply does the job. And she sat in it the way she sat behind her desk, like she owned both the chair and the space it occupied, and had no interest in explaining that to anyone. Her eyes were the thing he noticed most. They were the eyes of someone who has been let down enough times that disappointment no longer registers as a surprise, but who has not, despite all of that, entirely stopped looking for the exception to the pattern. "James Whitfield," she said, and it was flat. Not a question, she'd already read everything. Former Air Force, 8 years active, 3 deployments. Instrument-rated type ratings on 2 business jets. Medical current. Fractional and charter since you separated. She looked at him. "Why, private fractional schedule doesn't work with a 6-year-old, James said. "I need predictability. You're a single parent." "Yes. How does that affect your availability?" "It means I need reasonable advance notice on scheduling," James said, "which I understand is standard in this role regardless. It doesn't mean I'm unavailable." She studied him for a moment. 9 pilots, she said. "I know." Do you understand why she said it precisely? "And I'm not asking what Mr. Patton told you. I'm asking what you concluded." James considered the question for exactly as long as it deserved, which was not very long, because the answer was not complicated. "Some of them had a problem with your disability," he said. "Some had a problem with your management style. Some of them couldn't separate those 2 things from each other, and didn't know they couldn't." Something moved behind her eyes. Not much, just a flicker of something that had not expected to be seen. "And you," she said. "You're the CEO of an aerospace company," James said. "I'm a pilot. My job is to get you where you're going safely and on time. That's the entire scope of our professional relationship. I don't carry opinions about anything beyond that." Victoria Caldwell was quiet for a moment, not the calculating kind of quiet, but the kind that happens when someone says something that lands differently than you were braced for. "What happened to your wife?" she asked. He hadn't expected that. "Cancer," he said. 14 months ago. She did not say she was sorry. He noticed that, and something about it settled in him in a way he would not have been able to explain to anyone who wasn't standing where he was standing. People said sorry when they meant they didn't know what else to say. Victoria Caldwell, he was already beginning to understand, did not say things she didn't mean. "Tokyo," she said, picking up her pen. 3 weeks, 14 hours of flight time. Any conflicts, I'll need to arrange care for my daughter." "Of course." She wrote something. "Thomas will send you the standard contract. There's an NDA and a 60-day performance period." She looked up. "Any questions?" one James said. He met her eyes. "The 9 pilots who left, did any of them give you a reason you actually believed?" Victoria Caldwell looked at him for a long moment, the longest pause in an interview full of them, and then she said simply, "No." James stood up. "Then I'll see you on the tarmac." He was halfway down the hall when he heard her voice behind him. "Mr. Whitfield." He turned. She was in the office doorway, one hand resting still on the wheel of her chair, looking at him with the careful expression of someone making a bet they haven't fully decided on yet. "Don't make me regret this," she said. He held her gaze from across the hallway. "I won't," he said. And he said it the way he said everything that truly mattered all the way down. No hedging, no performance. The kind of certainty that does not need volume to be believed. The elevator came. He stepped inside. Behind him he heard no sound of retreat, just the particular stillness of someone who has stayed in the doorway, watching the doors close. Still watching even after the man is gone, like they're trying to read something in the air he left behind. James Whitfield knew that kind of silence. He had stood in it himself more than once. It was the silence of a person who wants very badly to trust someone and is terrified of being wrong about it again. He understood that feeling all the way down to the marrow. The elevator descended. He had $8 in his wallet and a daughter who had asked him at breakfast, still in her pajamas, eyes serious over her cereal bowl. "Daddy, are you gonna be okay today?" He pulled out his phone and typed a text to Mrs. Hutchins' long-term work starting up. Available to sit with Maya over the coming weeks. He pressed send, stepped out into the gray Chicago morning, stood on the sidewalk for just a moment, with the wind pulling at his collar, and let himself feel something he hadn't felt in a long, long time. It wasn't loud, and it wasn't certain, and it didn't look anything like happiness yet. But for the first time in 14 months, what James Whitfield felt standing on that sidewalk wasn't grief. It was close enough to hope that he decided to call it that. He walked to his truck. He had a daughter to pick up from school. And tomorrow, for the first time in a very long time, he had somewhere to be. Diane Whitfield had been a third-grade teacher at Roosevelt Elementary for 9 years, and she was the kind of woman who remembered the name of every server who had ever brought her coffee and kept a bowl of Halloween candy by the front door, not because their neighborhood got many trick-or-treaters, but because she said, you never knew who might need something sweet, and she could whistle any Motown song on request, including the hard ones, and she made terrible waffles and absolutely refused to discuss it. She had taught James how to really listen to someone, not to wait for your turn to speak, but to actually stop and receive what was being said, the way you receive a landing with your whole attention and your hands ready. And she had taught Maya how to ask the right questions, which was a different skill entirely, and possibly the more important one. She was 37 years old when the oncologist sat across from them in a room that smelled like recycled air and used words James had heard before in briefings, but never in a sentence that ended with his wife's name. Stage 4. Maya had been 4.5 at the time, old enough to sense that something in the architecture of their family had fundamentally shifted, old enough to know that the quality of the quiet in the house had changed in a way she couldn't name, but too young to understand what forever meant when it appeared at the end of a sentence that contained the word without. James did 3 things when they got home from that appointment. He sat in his truck in the driveway with the engine off for 20 minutes, not thinking anything in particular, just sitting with the weight of it, letting it settle into him the way cold settles into metal. Then he went inside and told Maya they were going to make her favorite dinner, which was spaghetti with the jarred sauce that Diane always called cheating, and James always called efficiency. And then he waited until Maya was asleep before he let himself fall apart in the hallway, outside her door, quietly, with one hand flat against the wall, and he only allowed himself to do it that once, because he understood with the blunt clarity of a man who had spent years in situations where panic was not an option, that the fall apart was a door you could open exactly once and still function, and more than once, and you became something your daughter needed you not to become. The next 14 months were the hardest of his life, and James Whitfield had landed aircraft in war zones. He learned which brands of children's shampoo Maya would tolerate, and which ones triggered a 40-minute negotiation. He learned that the emotional state of a 6-year-old can reverse completely by 7:15 in the morning over a matter as apparently small as which sock goes on first, and that this reversal requires exactly the same calm, methodical response as a cockpit warning light. Not panic, not escalation, just steady hands and a clear sequence of steps. He learned that grief does not arrive the way you expect it to. Not all at once like a wave, but in the small moments the Tuesday evening when he set 2 coffee mugs out of habit and stood holding one of them for a full minute, not knowing what to do with it, not knowing how to put it back without that simple act meaning something unbearable. The Saturday morning when Maya looked up at a clear winter sky and asked with absolute seriousness whether Mommy could hear them when they talked out loud. He had to clear his throat twice before he could answer that one. He told her yes, he believed so, or he made himself believe so, and in his experience, those 2 things amounted to the same thing. After Diane passed, The money lasted 4 months in the way that things that look like enough tend to last when they encounter reality, which is not long. He had his veterans' benefits. He had the savings account they'd built together over 11 years of careful decisions and deferred vacations and packing lunch instead of buying it. It looked like enough until it met the mortgage and the car payment and Maya's medical appointments and 2 months of hospice bills that insurance had covered the way. Insurance always covers the things that matter most, partially slowly, and with a volume of paperwork apparently designed to make you give up before you finish it. The commercial carriers weren't hiring at his experience level. A cargo company offered him a night shift route 3 weeks out of every 4, gone before Maya went to bed and back, after she'd already left for school. He looked at that offer for a long time, sitting at the kitchen table, after Maya was asleep running the numbers in his head. And then he said, "No." Maya was 6 years old. She had already lost her mother. He was not going to be the second parent to disappear on her, even into something as invisible and well-intentioned as a cargo route. His brother called from Denver and offered money. James thanked him and said no. It cost him something to say it more than the money itself, because what it cost him was the particular pride of a man who has always managed his own weight. But he said it because there are certain things you have to work through on your own terms. And he had always known which kind of man he was. He picked up weekend shifts at a regional flight school teaching instrument ratings to students who were younger than some of his socks. He mowed 2 lawns on his block. He was not ashamed of any of it, but it wasn't enough, and the number at the bottom of his bank statement kept moving in the wrong direction, slowly and steadily, and with the patient persistence of bad news, which always takes its time. On the morning he found the job posting, he had been up since 4:47 because Maya had a nightmare she couldn't describe and didn't want to talk about. And James had spent 45 minutes sitting on the edge of her bed with one hand on her back. Not talking, just present. Because in his experience, that was the only thing that actually helped. Not explanations, not reassurances, just the physical fact of another person in the room. Another heartbeat. Someone who would still be there if she opened her eyes. He made coffee and opened his laptop on the kitchen counter, and he checked the job boards the way he always checked them. And on the 4th board, on a Tuesday morning, he found a listing that used the phrase, "serious applicants only." And something in James Whitfield that had been very quiet for a very long time sat up a little straighter and paid attention. James Whitfield's morning routine was not a routine. In the casual sense, it was a structure built deliberately over years of cockpit discipline and reinforced over the past 14 months into something closer to a survival framework, because he had learned the hard way that the days when you most needed your routine were the days when it felt most pointless to follow it, and that following it anyway was the only thing that kept the floor under you when everything else was moving. He was awake at 5. He made 2 lunches, one for Maya, one for himself, because airport food cost $11 and tasted like a decision you were already regretting. And he laid out Maya's clothes on the chair beside her bed, in the order she'd put them on, which was something Diane had done, and James had taken over, without being asked to, just quietly, the way you take over the small things when the person who used to do them is no longer there to do them. He stood in Maya's doorway for a moment in the dark, looking at the shape of his daughter, under her blanket, listening to her breathe, and then he went to get dressed. Waking Maya was its own daily negotiation, conducted at approximately the same energy level as a UN trade agreement, and with roughly similar results. Bug. Time to get up. No. Yes, it's 6:40. That's nighttime. Mrs. Hutchins is coming at 7:15. She has animal crackers. The blanket came down 2 inches. 1 brown eye appeared. The good ones I negotiated. Maya sat up. James had been told by 3 different people in the past year that he was raising someone who would either run a corporation or a small country, and he had decided he was entirely fine with either outcome. At 7:15, Mrs. Hutchins arrived with the good animal crackers and the reliable lavender-scented calm of a woman who has raised 4 children of her own and is no longer surprised by anything. And James kissed Maya on the top of her head and went to work. The regional flight school where he picked up weekend shifts was a modest operation. 4 Cessnas, a Piper, and an instructor staff of 3, one of whom was 26 years old and had never flown anything with more than 1 engine, which James found more amusing than it probably should have struck a man in his situation. He taught instrument ratings, which meant sitting beside young students in small cockpits and watching them learn to trust gauges over instinct, which was harder than it sounded, because instinct felt like knowledge and gauges felt like information. And the difference between those two things was the difference between a pilot and a very experienced passenger. One Saturday morning, one of his students, a 23-year-old named Brandon, with genuine skill and the specific overconfidence that comes from having genuine skill and not yet having been surprised by the sky, asked him why he was teaching here instead of flying commercially. James did not answer. He corrected Brandon's instrument scan, pointed out that his descent rate was 40 feet per minute. Too aggressive for the conditions, and moved on, because there are questions that don't deserve an answer, and there are questions that deserve the only honest answer, which is silence. He kept a photo of Diane in the sun visor of his truck. He did not talk to it. He was not that kind of man, but sometimes, in the evenings, after a shift sitting in the school parking lot before he drove home, he would flip the visor down and look at it for a minute. Not for comfort exactly, and not for grief exactly, but in the particular way you look at something you have memorized completely and still need to see. He would look at it, and then he would flip the visor back up, and then he would drive home to his daughter. Maya's school pickup was reliably and without exception the best part of James Whitfield's day. Not because anything dramatic ever happened. Usually it was a backpack, bouncing a story about something at recess that would have been incomprehensible to any adult who hadn't been following the ongoing social drama of a first-grade classroom for the entire school year. But because it was the only moment in his day when no part of him was doing math. No part of him was calculating account balances or flight hours, or the probability that the next morning's job search would produce anything different from the morning before it. When Maya came running across the schoolyard toward him, he just crouched down and caught her, and listened, and everything else stopped, and that was the whole point. Mrs. Hutchins had said to him once about 2 months after Diane died, standing in his kitchen with a casserole she was leaving because she knew he wasn't eating properly. "She left you a good one." James had looked at Maya through the kitchen window, Maya in the backyard talking seriously to a dandelion, explaining something at length to it. "She left me her," he said, which was the most accurate thing he knew how to say about it. The morning after he found the listing, he sat at the kitchen table while Maya ate her cereal, and he read those words again. Specific operational requirements. Multiple previous candidates have found this position unsuitable, and he turned them over in his mind, the way you turn a problem over, looking for the shape of it, looking for where the opening is. Most people read a phrase like that and back away because the reasonable interpretation is that the job is difficult in ways the listing isn't prepared to be honest about. James Whitfield read it differently. He had spent 8 years in the Air Force and 11,000 hours in the air since, and in his experience, there was a very specific category of problem that collected a string of failures, not because it was unsolvable, but because it had not yet encountered the right kind of person. Those problems were not warnings, they were invitations. The right person just had to be paying attention when they came along. James Whitfield was paying attention. He finished his coffee, packed Maya's lunch, and picked up his phone. The first morning, James Whitfield walked out onto the tarmac at Chicago Executive Airport. The wind was coming straight off the lake at what the Weather Service called 15 knots, and what the ramp workers called the usual punishment, and it was cold enough to remind a person with complete clarity that there are many places in the world that are warmer than this, and that the people who built this city chose it anyway, because they were, as a category, not the kind of people who chose things based on comfort. The aircraft was a Gulfstream G550, and it was beautiful. The way very functional things are beautiful, cleanly without apology, in a language that spoke directly to the part of James that had spent his adult life understanding what machines could do and what they needed from the people who flew them. He checked every inch of it twice, anyway, because a pre-flight inspection you rush is a pre-flight inspection. You didn't do, and James Whitfield had learned that lesson not in a classroom, but in a cockpit over hostile terrain, where the cost of skipping a step was not a failed check ride. "You the new guy." The voice came from behind him, unhurried and dry as cracked leather. James turned to find a man with the sun-worn face of someone who had spent 25 years on airport ramps and had long since made peace with the fact that the weather was never going to improve. His name tag read, D. Cooper. "Darnell Cooper," the man said, without extending his hand, just stating it the way you state a fact. "Ground Chief, number 10, right, James Whitfield." James said. "Yes." Darnell Cooper looked at him for a moment, with the evaluating patience of a man who has watched 9 other pilots arrive at this same aircraft and has developed a very specific set of criteria. "You know what the boys have been calling this job? I imagine they've got a name for it. The ejection seat." Darnell said it without humor, just as information which, somehow, made it worse and better at the same time. "You want some advice?" "Sure, don't help her." He said it before James could react, and then held up both hands. "I don't mean how it sounds. What I mean is number 6. Big guy, real friendly, good instincts in the cockpit. He saw her coming across the ramp on her first morning, and he jogged over to push her chair. Didn't ask, just grabbed the handles and started pushing. What happened? Darnell's expression did not change. She told him to take his hands off her chair. Right there in front of the whole crew, the fueler, the baggage loader. Everybody. He apologized. Kept apologizing. Made it worse every time. He was done by the end of the month. Darnell paused. The apologies were the problem, not the first thing. James turned back to the wing and continued his inspection, running his hand along the leading edge with the slow, deliberate attention of a man who is thinking and working at the same time. "You don't touch a man's aircraft without permission," he said. Same principle. Darnell Cooper looked at him for a long second, and then he laughed once short, the slightly startled laugh of a man who has just heard something obvious, said so plainly that it surprised him, and he shook his head and walked away. Later that morning, he told the fueler that number 10 might last 2 weeks instead of 1, which from Darnell Cooper was essentially a ringing endorsement. At 9:12, a black SUV came through the gate, and James stayed exactly where he was at the base of the air stair and finished his checklist. He did not look up when he heard the car doors. He did not look up when he heard the soft mechanical whir of the lift descending from the side of the vehicle. He did not look up when he heard the wheels of a chair cross the tarmac. He looked up when she was exactly 10 feet away, because that was when a person looks up when they are expecting someone. "Miss Caldwell," he said. "Good morning." "Mr. Whitfield." Victoria Caldwell stopped at the base of the stairs and looked at him with the expression of a coin flip still in the air. "Weather ceilings are low but lifting," James said before she could speak. "We've got light chop up from about 8,000 to 16. Boston is clear. We'll be on the ground at 11:54, local barring arrival congestion. And if the arrival backs up, I'll tell you before it costs you anything." He glanced at her. "You have a 2 o'clock. You need to know whether you have time to review something in the car, which means you need my actual number, not my best guess." Victoria raised an eyebrow approximately 1/4 of an inch. "That's more information than I usually get before a flight." "There's a lift on the port side," James continued. "I reviewed the aircraft configuration last night. It's rated for 400-pound service twice this year. Last inspection in January cycles, in about 90 seconds. He glanced at his watch. You want to board now or finish that call first because you were on the phone in the car and you hung up about 30 feet ago, and I'd guess you weren't done. There was a pause. Thomas, standing 3 feet behind Victoria, had gone very still in the particular way an assistant goes still when he is trying to determine whether he needs to start updating a job posting or not. I wasn't done, Victoria said. Then finish. We've got a 9-minute window before I need you in a seat. She turned her chair around and made the call, and James went back up the air stair to the flight deck, and Thomas stood alone on the tarmac with the expression of a man who has just witnessed something he has no existing category for. They were airborne at 9:31. James Whitfield settled into the left seat, checked his instruments, and felt for the first time in 14 months the particular quiet confidence of a man who is exactly where he is supposed to be, doing exactly the thing he was built to do. 31,000 feet below them, Chicago shrunk into a grid of gray streets and brown rivers, and the wide, cold blue of the lake. And James pointed the nose northeast toward Boston and flew. The chop hit at 11,000 feet exactly where the forecast said it would, and James keyed the intercom approximately 4 seconds before the first bump. Because 4 seconds was exactly how long it took for the information to be useful to someone sitting in a cabin with a cup of coffee on the armrest. Miss Caldwell, we've got light chop for the next 4 or 5 minutes. It's in the forecast. Nothing unexpected, and I'm going to ask for a block altitude to see if I can find something smoother. If your coffee is on the table, you'll want to hold it. Silence for a moment and then dry as the high desert. It was on the table. Then I'm about 6 seconds late, and I apologize. Through the open cockpit door, very faintly, something that might have been a laugh. Gone so fast, he wasn't sure he hadn't imagined it. They were over eastern Ohio when Victoria Caldwell spoke through the intercom without being spoken to, which was the first time she had done so. Mr. Whitfield. Ma'am, the pilot before you used to announce turbulence after it happened, she said. Like reporting the weather, rather than flying through it. That's not a report, James said. That's an apology. A pause. What's the difference? A report tells you what's coming, so you can decide something, said, keeping his eyes on the instruments. An apology tells you what already happened, so the person saying it can feel better about it. The silence that followed was longer than the others. Then Victoria Caldwell said quietly, and with a completeness that suggested the topic was closed, yes, and did not say anything else for the remainder of the flight. They were on the ground in Boston at 11:51, 3 minutes early. Thomas checked his watch twice. The Dallas leg was Friday, and the Dallas leg was where James first understood what was expected of him and what was possible between them. He had been up since 3:30 because Maya had woken at 3:40 and found him in the kitchen, padding out in her socks, with her hair in 17 different directions, backpack lines still visible on her cheeks from falling asleep with it on. Are you leaving? Yeah, Bug. He crouched down to her level always because Diane had taught him that years ago, and he had never unlearned it. They're not short, she used to say. They're just closer to the ground. Before school, Mrs. Hutchins will walk you, and I'll be home by 7 tonight. We'll do pancakes for dinner. Pancakes aren't dinner. Pancakes are whatever we decide they are, James said. That's the beauty of pancakes. Maya considered this with the gravity it apparently deserved, and then she hugged him around the neck, the way 6-year-olds hug, which is with their entire body weight, and absolutely no concern for your spine. And she said into his shoulder, "Fly safe, Daddy." James Whitfield, 41 years old veteran of 3 combat deployments, held on for exactly 1 second longer than the hug required. En route to Dallas at 8:40 over Missouri, Victoria's voice came through the intercom, and it was not the voice she'd used on Tuesday. Tighter. Something underneath it. Mr. Whitfield, I need Dallas moved up. Say again. The meeting was at 2. It's now 11:30. I need to be on the ground with time to get downtown. James looked at the clock at the fuel state at the arrival charts. I can give you 11:05 on the ground. A beat. That's an hour and 40 minutes earlier than filed. Yes, ma'am. I'm going to ask for direct routing and a higher altitude. If they give me both, I'll take 20 minutes off the en-route portion. The rest comes from the ground. He paused. I already called ahead. Your car is repositioning now, and I've arranged for a closer gate, which puts you 9 minutes closer to the exit than the one they'd assigned by default. The silence on the intercom lasted 4 full seconds. You already called the car, Victoria said. Not a question. You had a meeting shift on Tuesday and another on Wednesday, James said. Both got pushed earlier. I figured Friday had a chance. You figured. It's called planning ahead, ma'am. Pilots do it professionally. Another silence, and then Victoria Caldwell said, in a tone he had not yet heard from her quieter flatter, and with something underneath it that had the texture of a thing long held, and only now beginning to be set down. The last 9 men who sat in that seat told me my schedule was impossible. Your schedule's not impossible, James said. It's hard. Those aren't the same word. They were on the ground in Dallas at 11:03. Thomas stopped checking his watch after that. He started watching James's face instead with the careful attention of a man looking for the seam in something that appears to have none. It was a Thursday night in the second week when everything nearly came apart. And it came apart not because of anything James had done wrong, but because Mrs. Hutchins's sister had a bad fall in Milwaukee, and there was simply no version of the next 12 hours that worked, no arrangement that could be made, no number that came out right, no matter how many times James sat at his kitchen table at 10:40 at night and ran it. He tried 3 numbers. 2 didn't answer. 1 was in Cincinnati for a funeral. At 7 the next morning he called Thomas. I've got a childcare situation, James said without preamble, because Thomas did not need the editorial, and James did not have the energy for it. I can fly, but my daughter would need to come to the airport and sit in the FBO lounge during the 90-minute ground stop in Cleveland. If that's not acceptable, I need to know now, not at 8:30. The hold lasted 90 seconds. James spent all 90 of them watching Maya eat cereal at the kitchen counter, feet swinging 6 inches off the floor, utterly unconcerned with the conversation happening 10 feet away, and practiced the thing he had gotten very good at over the past 14 months, which was staying calm on the outside while the floor went out from under him on the inside. Thomas came back. Miss Caldwell says, "Bring her." James let out a breath. "Tell her thank you, and tell her Maya will be in the lounge with a coloring book, and she won't be anywhere near the aircraft." That's not what Miss Caldwell said. What did she say? Thomas sounded like a man reading a sentence in a language he technically speaks, but doesn't fully understand. She said, "Bring her. She can sit in the cabin. It's a 900-mile flight, and there are 12 empty seats, and I'm not putting a 6-year-old in a lounge with cable news for 3 hours." James stood in his kitchen for a moment. "Okay," he said. At 8:50, Maya Carter walked onto the tarmac at Chicago Executive Airport, holding her father's hand, wearing a purple backpack that was approximately the same size she was, and stopped dead about 15 feet from the air stair. Victoria Caldwell was already at the base of it. James felt Maya's hand tighten in his. He braced because he knew what was coming. He was a parent, and parents always know what's coming, roughly 4 seconds before it happens, and never quite in time to prevent it. Maya let go of his hand, walked directly up to Victoria Caldwell, and said at full and unapologetic volume, "Are your wheels fast?" James closed his eyes. Thomas, 6 feet away, went the specific shade of gray that can only be produced by the intersection of genuine alarm and the complete inability to do anything about the situation. And Victoria Caldwell looked down at the 6-year-old standing in front of her, and something happened to her face that James had not seen in 2 weeks of working for her, and would not have believed if he hadn't been standing right there on that tarmac to witness it with his own eyes. She smiled. "Pretty fast," she said. "But not faster than a bike." "Not faster than a bike," Maya agreed seriously. "Faster than walking." "Depends who's walking." "Faster than my dad," Victoria said, and looked directly up at James over Maya's head. Maya shrieked with the completely unguarded laughter of a child who has just been let in on a joke by an adult who did not talk down to her or slow down or adjust the volume of their personality to accommodate the fact that she was 6, and James stood on the tarmac and felt something in his chest turn over slowly that he was entirely unprepared for. "Maya," he managed. "This is Miss Caldwell." Victoria said Victoria Caldwell, who in 2 years had corrected exactly no one on that point. Maya stuck out her hand with tremendous formality. "I'm Maya Whitfield. I'm 6. I'm going to be 7 in October." Victoria shook her hand. "I run this company." Maya's eyes went enormous. "The whole company. The whole thing. Are you the boss of my dad, technically?" Maya turned around and gave James a look of pure delighted, slightly betrayed amusement. "Daddy, your boss is a lady, I noticed. She's the boss of you, I'm aware." "Does she tell you what to do?" constantly said Victoria Caldwell, and Maya laughed again, and Thomas made a small sound beside the air stair that was the sound of a man watching something irreversible occur and being not entirely sure whether it was wonderful or catastrophic. James buckled Maya into seat 4A of a $14 million aircraft, checked her seatbelt twice, and went to fly it to Cleveland. What happened at 10,000 feet over Lake Michigan was not something James planned to hear. Maya was looking out the window, with the full concentration she applied to things that genuinely interested her, and Victoria was working on her laptop across the aisle. And then Maya turned around and asked, in the direct way that children ask things that adults have spent years learning not to ask, "Why do you use the wheels?" Thomas, seated across the aisle, audibly stopped breathing. "Because my legs don't work," Victoria said without looking up. "Why don't they work?" "Because I got hurt." "Did it hurt a lot?" A pause. "Yes." "Does it hurt now?" Another pause longer. "Not the way it used to." Maya was quiet for a moment, processing this. Then she said, "My mom died." James's hands went still on the controls. He should have keyed the intercom. He didn't either because some part of him understood he was hearing something that was not about him and not for him and needed to simply happen the way it was happening without interruption. "I know," Victoria said quietly. "Do you have a mom?" "I had one. She died when I was 9. "Do you have a dad?" "I had one of those too." "Where is he?" And James Whitfield. 31,000 feet over Indiana, heard Victoria Caldwell say to his 6-year-old daughter, in a voice that had gone very soft and very steady and did not shake at all. "He died in a plane crash. I was there." "Were you scared?" "Yes." "Are you scared now?" A long silence, long enough that James found himself holding his breath at the controls. "No," Victoria said. "Your dad's flying." James looked straight ahead out the windscreen at the flat, gray afternoon sky over Indiana and had to make himself breathe consciously, deliberately, one breath at a time. The way you breathe when something has hit you in a place you didn't know you were keeping unguarded. Maya fell asleep somewhere over Ohio, her head tipped against the oval window and her purple backpack still firmly on her back, because she had refused to take it off on the grounds that it contained something important, which, when James had investigated earlier, turned out to be a library book, 3 crayons, and a small plastic dinosaur that she had named Gerald for reasons she declined to explain. When they began their descent into Cleveland, James came back through the cabin and found Victoria Caldwell sitting exactly where she had been for the past 40 minutes. Her laptop open in front of her and clearly not being looked at with a neatly folded blanket from the galley draped over Maya's lap. Maya had not woken up. The blanket was small and blue and had been placed with the particular care you use when you are trying very hard not to disturb someone. Neither of them mentioned the blanket. "She's a good kid," Victoria said at the top of the air stair without turning around. "She's her mother's kid," James said. Victoria stopped. "No," she said quietly, but with a precision that made it not quite a disagreement, and not quite a correction, but something more interesting than either. "She's not." And then she went down the lift and across the tarmac, and James stood at the top of the stairs, holding a blanket and not knowing what to do with what he was feeling. 6 weeks later, somewhere over the North Atlantic at 2 in the morning, Chicago time with the cabin dark, and Thomas asleep, and Pete Larson on his rest cycle, and 4 miles of black water moving by under them at 480 knots, Victoria Caldwell wheeled herself to the cockpit door and stopped there. "Mr. Whitfield." "Ma'am." "Do you sleep during rest cycles? That's not what you came to ask me." A pause. Then, because it was 2 in the morning, and there was nothing between them and the dark but altitude. "Not much," she said. "Not since Diane." 14 months, James said. He kept his eyes on the instruments. "You'd think it would get easier?" "It doesn't get easier," Victoria said. "It gets different. It stops being a wall you walk into and starts being weather. It's just always there. You dress for it." James was quiet for a moment. Then, "That's the most accurate description of grief I've ever heard. It's not mine. Man in my squadron said it. He lost a brother. Did it help him? He flew for 11 more years," James said. "Never missed a day. They were quiet together for a while, and the engines hummed, and the stars were very bright over the Atlantic. And then Victoria said, 'My board wants to sell the aviation division. 40% of revenue. They've been pushing it for 8 months, and I've said no 4 times. Last week, a board member told me in a room with 6 other people that my father would have taken the deal." James turned his head slightly. "Would he have—" "No." Her voice did not rise. It never rose. "My father built that division from nothing in a garage in Rockford in 1987. He would have died before he sold it." A pause, which is, I suppose, a poor choice of words. James did not laugh. But he did not flinch either, and she noticed that, and she went on. "They're not going to stop." "Then don't let them. You don't understand how boards work." "No." James agreed. "But I understand how people work, and a man who tells you your dead father would have disagreed with you isn't making a business argument. He's making a personal one. He just doesn't want you to notice." Victoria was quiet for a long moment. The stars moved slowly past the windscreen. 9 pilots, she said finally. "Ma'am, 9 pilots quit. You want to know what one of them ever did?" She let the question sit for a moment. "Asked me a single question about my job." She turned her chair around and went back into the dark cabin. James flew the rest of the way to London and thought about how a person could be surrounded by 200 employees and a full board of directors and an assistant who would rearrange his entire life for her comfort and still be in every way that actually counted completely alone. About how loneliness is not the absence of people. It is the presence of people who have already decided what you are before they walked into the room. He thought about the question he had asked her in the interview, the one he had asked, not as strategy but because he genuinely wanted to know the answer. And he thought about the fact that she had said nobody had ever asked her that. Not in 2 years. Not once. He thought about Maya at 31,000 feet, asking, "Does it hurt now?" instead of, "Does it hurt?" Because those were, as Maya apparently already understood at age 6, 2 completely different questions, and one of them assumed it still did, and one of them left the answer open, and the open answer was the harder one to ask, because it required you to actually wait for it. James flew. Below them, the Atlantic went on, dark and cold and indifferent. And above them, the stars were the same stars. They always were scattered across the sky without arrangement or message, which was either the most comforting thing in the universe or the loneliest, depending on the night. Tonight, James thought it was somewhere in between. They landed at Luton at 6:40 in the morning, local time, with a thin gray English rain coming down the way English rain comes down in March, which is not dramatically but with tremendous patience, like it has all day, and has decided to use it. The board presentation was at 9. At 8:15, Thomas called James's phone from the car. "Mr. Whitfield." "Where are you?" "On the aircraft. Miss Caldwell wants you at the presentation." James blinked. "I'm the pilot." "I'm aware. Thomas, why does she want the pilot at a board presentation?" There was a pause on the line, and when Thomas spoke again, his voice had changed in a way that James didn't like lower. More careful, the voice of a man delivering information he would prefer not to be delivering. "Because Howard Greer flew in last night," Thomas said, "on a different aircraft, and nobody told her he was coming." James was very still for a moment. "How many board members are in London right now?" Another pause. "All of them," Thomas said. James was in the car in 90 seconds. The Caldwell Aero Systems UK offices were in a building near Canary Wharf that had been designed by someone who believed that glass was a personality. James came through the lobby at 8:40 in a flight jacket and a pilot's uniform, looking exactly like what he was, which was staff, and he did not care even slightly. He found Victoria in a side room off the main conference floor, alone with a printout in her hands that she was not looking at. She did not look up when he came in. They rescheduled the vote, she said, moved it up 11 days, filed the notice at 4:15 this morning, London time. Legal minimum notice period per the bylaws. Not 1 minute more. James closed the door behind him. "They knew I'd be in the air," Victoria said. 8 hours over the Atlantic. No secure line. No counsel. "They filed it while I was flying." Victoria. It was the first time he had used her name, and she looked up. Her eyes were dry. That was the part that hit him. They were completely, perfectly dry, and that was somehow so much worse than crying would have been. It's a vote of no confidence. Greer has been building it for 8 months. He needs 6 votes. He has 5, and he doesn't have the 6th yet. So he needs a reason, James said. Something recent. Something that looks like evidence. Something dramatic, Victoria said. Something that gives the 6th vote an easy reason. The door opened. Howard Greer came in like a man walking into a party he'd organized himself, broad-chested, silver-haired, with the particular warmth of someone who has learned to use warmth as a precision instrument. He was 64 years old, and he said everything pleasantly, which was the first thing James noticed. And the second thing James noticed was that he used the dead man within 90 seconds. "Victoria, there she is." He spread his hands. Terrible timing on the notice. Legal insisted. "You know how it is. Legal insisted you file at 4:15 in the morning London time while I was over the Atlantic. Legal insisted we file within the window." Vance spread his hands again. "I don't write the bylaws." He paused. "Victoria, your father wrote the bylaws." And there it was, 8:50 in the morning, and he'd already invoked Raymond Caldwell. James watched Victoria's hands on the arms of her chair. They did not move. Nothing about her moved, but something behind her eyes went somewhere very far down and locked itself in. Greer looked at James then, and his face did something interesting. It did not drop. It reorganized the way the face of a skilled man reorganizes when he encounters something he didn't expect, but is experienced enough to absorb without showing the work. "I'm sorry, are we in a meeting? I didn't realize." He looked at Victoria. "This is Mr. Whitfield," Victoria said. "My pilot." "Your pilot." Greer's eyebrows went up precisely 1 millimeter. In a strategy room. He's not in a strategy room, Victoria said. He's in a room. You walked into it. Greer actually laughed, a genuine and appreciative laugh, and clapped his hands together once. That's the Caldwell in you, he said warmly. He turned to James with his hand out. Howard Greer. Board 22 years. You must be the one who's lasted. James shook his hand. It was a firm, practiced handshake, the kind developed over decades of rooms like this one. James Whitfield. 10 pilots, Mr. Whitfield. You know that 10 in 14 months. 9, James said. Greer blinked. I'm sorry, 9 pilots left. I'm the 10th. James let go of his hand. 9 and 10 aren't the same number, sir. There was approximately 1.5 seconds of silence, in which Howard Greer recalculated something, and James watched him do it, and Victoria watched James watch him do it. And then Greer smiled wider than before and said, well, attention to detail. That's exactly what we want in a cockpit, and tapped the doorframe twice on his way out. Chin up, Victoria, he said pleasantly, and was gone. The door clicked shut. He says that to you, James said. He says it to everyone, does he? James looked at the closed door. 22 years on the board, and he doesn't know how many pilots have quit on you, but he knows the exact filing deadline in the bylaws to the minute. He turned back to Victoria. That man's not sloppy. He wants you to think he's sloppy. At 9:04, Thomas knocked and entered, carrying 2 things coffee for Victoria and a face the color of fresh drywall. They added an item to the agenda. What item? Operational risk review. Thomas swallowed. They want to discuss the aviation department, executive transport specifically. He checked his tablet. There's an attachment, a risk memo, 12 pages, uploaded to the board portal at 4:19 this morning. 4 minutes after the notice, Victoria said, Yes, ma'am. Read me the header. Thomas's mouth opened. Closed. He looked at James once quickly, and James understood in that glance that whatever was on the tablet was going to be bad in a specific and deliberate way. Then Thomas looked back at Victoria and read, Assessment of personal and institutional risk factors in executive air travel, with particular reference to medical contingency, egress capability, and command continuity. The room was very quiet. Egress capability, Victoria said. Yes, ma'am. That's a fire word, James said quietly. That's the word you use when you want the room to picture an aircraft on fire and someone who can't get themselves out of it. Victoria's hands were flat on the arms of her chair. She stared at this table for 4 full seconds without speaking, which James had learned in 9 weeks was one of the clearest signals she gave that something had landed precisely where it was aimed. Marcus Thomas. She corrected herself without explanation. Get me Eleanor Nash, not her assistant. Her. She's in Chicago, ma'am. It's 3 a.m. Wake her. At 9:22, Eleanor Nash was on speaker from her bedroom in Winnetka, and she sounded like a woman who had in fact been awake for some time already, which turned out to be true. I saw it at midnight, she said. I've been reading it since. Why didn't you call me? You were over the Atlantic, Victoria. No secure line. A pause. That's why they did it then. How bad. It's careful, Eleanor said, and the word, careful, carried the particular weight of a lawyer, describing something that has been engineered to do maximum damage without leaving fingerprints. There's not one sentence in 12 pages you could put in front of a jury. It never says disability. It never says wheelchair. It says medical contingency reduced independent mobility profile insurer sensitivity. They got a broker's letter, she continued. Page 9. an aviation underwriter stating that executive transport risk assessments are, quote, sensitive to command continuity factors. What does that mean? James said. There was a pause on the line. Who's that? Eleanor asked. My pilot, Victoria said. Another pause longer. Then Eleanor Park said something James had not expected from a general counsel, which was that she chose to answer him directly instead of waiting for permission. It means nothing, Mr. Whitfield, in isolation. It's a letter from a broker saying that, in the abstract, insurers think about who is on board a private aircraft and whether everyone can be evacuated. That's true of every executive aircraft on Earth. It doesn't name Victoria. It doesn't have to. It's on page 9 of a memo about her. So it's a picture, James said. It's a picture, Eleanor agreed. They're not going to argue she can't do the job. They're going to put 12 pages of neutral language in front of 6 people and let those 6 people build the argument in their own heads. And then Howard Greer is going to look sad about it. At 9:31, Eleanor Nash said the thing that changed the shape of the entire morning. Victoria. Don't go in there swinging. Excuse me, that memo is engineered to make you angry. It's designed with precision to make you walk into that room and call it what it is, which is discrimination, which is exactly what it is. And if you do that, you hand them the second half of the play, emotional reactive, unable to take criticism. That's the trap. So I sit there, you sit there, you let them table it. You say 4 words, I'll respond in writing. And then you get on a plane, and you go to Tokyo, and you close the Tanaka contract, because $140 million in signed revenue is the only thing on Earth that outvotes a memo. Nothing else will do it. Not dignity, not facts, not how right you are. Revenue. Silence, Victoria Eleanor said. Do you hear me? I hear you. Say it back. I'll respond in writing. Good. A breath. And Victoria, do not be late to Tokyo. Respond in writing. Good. A breath. And Victoria, do not be late to Tokyo. The call ended at 9:34. Nobody in the room said anything for a while, and the rain came down outside the glass building with its patient English persistence. And somewhere in the building beyond the closed door, people were making coffee and looking at agendas and having no idea what was happening in this side room. Then Victoria said, without looking up Mr. Whitfield, 9 days. Tokyo. She looked at him. Tell me right now, honestly, if there is any weather, any maintenance, any single thing between here and the 14th that could make me late. James thought about it. He did not rush it. There was something almost unbearable Victoria would later tell Eleanor about being taken that seriously. Weather is a coin flip that far out, James said. Maintenance is the aircraft. Crew rest is math, and I'll manage it. He held her gaze. And if the coin comes up wrong, I'll fly it wrong side up and get you there anyway. That's not an answer. No, ma'am, James agreed. It's a commitment. Those aren't the same word either. At 10:30, Victoria Caldwell wheeled into the boardroom on the 16th floor of the Caldwell Aero Systems UK offices, and James stood in the hallway outside the closed door, with his hands folded, and waited. He had stood in hallways before. He had stood in hospital corridors. He had stood in base briefing rooms while decisions were being made behind closed doors that would determine the shape of the next 72 hours. And he had stood in all of those places with the same quality of stillness he carried. Now the kind of stillness that isn't peace, but is the thing you learn to build in place of peace when peace is not available. But this hallway was different from those hallways, because in those hallways he had known more or less what the variables were. Here he did not. Here there were 11 people in a room and a 12-page memo, and a silver-haired man who had spent 22 years learning exactly how much pressure to apply, and exactly where to apply it. And Victoria Caldwell alone against all of it, with 4 words and a will that James had come to understand was not stubbornness, not refusal, but something older and more structural than either of those things. The accumulated determination of a woman who had already survived the worst thing that could happen to a person, and had decided quietly, and without announcing it, that she was not going to be stopped by things that were merely difficult. It was the longest hour and 10 minutes James had spent since a hospital waiting room in Chicago 14 months ago. The door opened at 11:40. Victoria came through it with her chin exactly level and her expression exactly neutral, and James knew instantly from the particular quality of her posture that she had done it, and done it well. "Tabled," she said, "pending my written response. You said the 4 words. I said the 4 words." She was past him 3 feet down the hallway, Thomas already falling into step beside her, reading the afternoon schedule from his tablet. The machine of her day already moving forward, as it always moved forward, without pause, without accommodation. With the relentless momentum of someone who has learned that the moment you stop is the moment the things that want to stop you catch up, Ma'am James said. She stopped. "That was the hardest thing I've watched anybody do in a long time," James said. "And I couldn't even see it." Victoria Caldwell did not turn around. She sat there in the middle of the hallway, perfectly still, and James saw her shoulders drop approximately half an inch. Not a collapse, not even a sag, just the half-inch of release that happens when a person has been holding something at full tension for long enough that a single moment of recognition is enough to allow the smallest fraction of it to go. Then she was moving again. Thomas was reading her the afternoon. The day continued. They flew home Friday. On Saturday morning, James stood on the sideline of a soccer field in a neighborhood park in the thin March sunshine and watched Maya chase a ball with the tactical sophistication of a golden retriever who has been told about soccer but not quite shown it, and she scored a goal on her own team's net and raised both arms in triumph anyway. And James laughed so hard he had to put his hand on his knee to keep from folding over. On the drive home, Maya, who had been quiet for several minutes, in a way that meant she was working something out, said, "Daddy, is Victoria coming to my birthday?" James nearly went through a red light. "Bug. Victoria is my boss. That's not really how—" "Why not?" "Because she's not. It's professional. That's just not how it—" James opened his mouth to explain the clearly delineated boundaries of an executive pilot relationship to a 6-year-old, and discovered, with the particular helplessness that only parenting produces, that he did not have a single sentence that would survive contact with Maya's follow-up questions. "I'll ask," he said. "Okay," Maya said, satisfied, and went back to her juice box, because in her world, the matter was now entirely resolved and required no further discussion. James drove the rest of the way home and tried to identify the exact moment at which the ground had shifted under him and couldn't find it, which was either because it had happened too gradually to locate, or because he had not, until just now, been looking. Darnell Cooper called James at 6 in the morning on a Monday 4 days before Tokyo, and the first thing James noticed was that Darnell, who had in the course of 6 weeks never once called James for any reason other than a direct operational need, sounded careful. Not alarmed. Careful, which in James's experience was worse. "You need to come down here," Darnell said. "Darnell, it's 6. I know what time it is. Come down here." James was at the hangar at 6:40. Darnell met him on the ramp and took him around the back of the aircraft and up a maintenance stand, without speaking, which was also not something Darnell Cooper did, because Darnell Cooper was a man who believed in efficient language and used it constantly. The silence on the stairs was its own kind of information. He pointed at the engine 2 pylon. "Fire detection loop," he said. "Number 2, somebody replaced it. Saturday. Work orders signed. It's legitimate. It's in the system." James looked at the pylon, then at Darnell. That loop wasn't due. Due in 11 months. Who wrote the discrepancy? Nobody. Who's the tech? Not on our contract. Darnell held out a work order, and James noticed that Darnell's hand was not entirely steady as he held it out. And Darnell Cooper had been on airport ramps for 25 years, and James had never once seen his hands do anything but what he told them to. Authorization came down through a corporate maintenance budget line I have never seen in 25 years on this ramp. Approved 8 days ago. 8 days ago. James felt that land exactly where it was supposed to land. 8 days ago, he said. Day before they filed the notice in London, Darnell said. James looked at his engine for a long time without speaking. The morning light was coming up slowly over the eastern end of the airfield, cold and pale, and the aircraft stood there in it, the way aircraft always stand, patient, unknowing, entirely innocent of whatever was being done around it. Is it airworthy? James said. Darnell wiped his mouth. That's the part that's going to keep you up. Yes, everything checks. The work is good. The parts are right. The signatures are right. There is not one single thing I can point at and say this is wrong. Then why did you call me at 6 in the morning? Darnell looked at him, and in 25 years on ramps and 6 weeks of working with James Whitfield, it was the most direct look he had given him. Because in 25 years, he said nobody has ever done unscheduled maintenance on an airplane I take care of without telling me first. Not once, not one time. He paused. I don't know what it means, but I know what it feels like. James looked at the engine for another long moment. Then he looked at Darnell. From now until we're back from Tokyo, he said nobody touches this aircraft unless you or I are standing right there. That's not really how nobody James said. Darnell looked at him. Then yeah, okay. James drove home and did not tell Victoria. He thought about it for 2 full days, sat with it at the kitchen table both nights, while Maya slept, turning it over, examining it from every angle. And then he didn't tell her. There was no evidence. There was a feeling in the stomach of a ramp mechanic. There was a work order that was completely legitimate. There was a part that had been replaced correctly with the right components by a licensed technician at the direction of a properly authorized corporate budget line. There was nothing. There was just a feeling. And James Whitfield had spent 8 years in the Air Force in places where a feeling in your stomach was the least admissible thing in any official record, and also reliably the thing that kept you alive. So he did the only thing he knew how to do with a feeling that had no evidence he planned around it. Tuesday night, James sat at the kitchen table until 1 in the morning with charts spread out and a legal pad and his laptop, and he called the Anchorage station manager, a man named Bart Hendricks, whom James had never spoken to and would likely never speak to again, and talked with him for 40 minutes about runway conditions and maintenance base capabilities and instrument approach procedures for a field he had never landed at and fervently hoped he would never need. Wednesday night the same. Thursday, he replanned the Pacific crossing 3 separate ways, built each one from scratch, cross-checked each fuel load against the performance charts for the G5550 in the conditions forecast for that date, and then he built a fuel load that was 4,000 pounds above the legal minimum and made the performance numbers work anyway, which cost him in climb rate and cruise efficiency, and took an additional 20 minutes of calculations to justify, and he wrote none of it in any official document, because he had no explanation that anyone who wasn't Darnell Cooper would understand. He memorized every alternate field between Chicago and Tokyo, the way he'd been quizzed on them in the Air Force, because in a very real sense, he was going to be quizzed, and the examiner wasn't going to be a Czech airman in a simulator. On Thursday night at midnight, Maya found him at the table. She appeared in the kitchen doorway in her socks and her pajamas, with the small bear she'd been sleeping with since Diane died, and she looked at the charts, and then at her father, with the serious, unhurried attention she brought to things that genuinely concerned her. Is that Tokyo? The ocean between here and Tokyo. James said, "That's a lot of ocean." "It is." Maya climbed into the chair beside him and put her chin on the table so that her eyes were at chart level, and she studied the blue expanse of the Pacific with total seriousness for a while. Then she looked at James. "Daddy," she said, "are you scared?" James set down his pen. He could have said no, that was the answer. The expected answer. The answer that kept the floor under her and let her sleep. But Maya was her mother's daughter in all the ways that mattered, including the way that meant she could tell the difference between an answer and a truth. "A little," he said. Maya nodded slowly the way she nodded when she was processing something important, like a small person doing large arithmetic. "Victoria said she's not scared when you're flying," she said. James's throat closed without warning. She said that on the airplane. Maya continued. "When I asked her if she was scared now, she said no because you're flying." She yawned enormously, her whole face involved in it. "So you don't have to be scared." "She's not. So you don't have to be either." She slid off the chair without further ceremony and padded back down the hallway to her room, the bear trailing from her hand by one ear, and James listened to her door click softly shut. And then he sat alone at his kitchen table at midnight with a chart of the Pacific Ocean in front of him and put his face in his hands for 10 seconds. Then he picked up the pen. On Saturday morning, he briefed Victoria on the tarmac with the same economy and precision he had used for every briefing for 9 weeks. Weather at the back half of the route models disagreeing, which was the worst thing they could do. They could do extra fuel, loaded he'd know more in 6 hours. Tokyo timeline still achievable. Victoria studied him for a moment. "Mr. Whitfield." "Ma'am." "Say the thing pilots say." He looked at her. "What thing?" "The thing where you tell me the airplane doesn't care about my board." James almost smiled, the corner of his mouth moving the fraction of an inch it moved, when something genuinely caught him. "The airplane doesn't care about your board, ma'am," he said. "That's the best news you've had all month." Victoria Caldwell looked at him for one moment, something in her expression that was not quite a smile, but was in the same neighborhood, and then she turned her chair toward the air stair. "Let's go," she said. They were wheels up at 11:09. The first 8 hours of the Pacific crossing were in the way of things that later become important, entirely uneventful. Black water below quiet radios, coffee that declined in quality at a rate that Pete Larson tracked with mournful attention, and the two of them trading rest cycles with the practiced ease of professionals who have learned to share a cockpit without crowding each other. They said maybe 40 words to each other in 8 hours, which was approximately 40 words more than the airplane required, and exactly the right number for 2 people doing a serious job well. At hour 9, Pete Larson looked at his weather screen and said quietly, "That's not great." The system had not moved north the way the European model had predicted. It had not sat still the way the American model had predicted either. It had done the third thing, which was the worst thing, which was to deepen and shift south, putting it squarely across the route. With cloud tops, the satellite estimated well above the altitude the Gulf Stream could climb to. There was no going over it. "Options," James said. "North deviation," Pete said. "Costs us roughly 400 miles. He pulled up the fuel. State looked at it. Looked at James. We'd be cutting it close on legal minimums if we hadn't. He stopped, ran the numbers again. Looked at James differently. "We've got it," he said. "We've got the fuel. Run it." Pete ran it twice carefully, and then he looked at the fuel log that showed 4,000 pounds above the minimum James had filed. And then he looked at James with the expression of a man putting 2 things together that he hadn't known were connected. "You planned for this," he said. "I planned for something," James said. James keyed the intercom. "Miss Caldwell, the weather did the thing I was hoping it wouldn't. It's on our route and I'm not going through it. I'm going north around. It costs us about 50 minutes, and we have the fuel. You'll be on the ground in Tokyo, at 8:05. Monday morning, local, instead of 7:15. That's 55 minutes to your meeting, instead of an hour 45. A pause. Is 55 minutes enough? Thomas told me the hotel is 19 minutes from the airport at that hour, James said. And the meeting is in the hotel. You asked Thomas. In Chicago. On Wednesday. Because I wanted to know how much margin I could afford to lose before I had to start making bad decisions. A silence that went on long enough that Pete Larson glanced over. Fly north, Victoria said. They flew north, and at hour 11 and 40 minutes, at 2:48 in the morning, Chicago time with the Kamchatka Peninsula, somewhere below them, under 4,000 feet of cloud, and then several miles of very cold water. Below that the master caution light came on. Pete Larson said a word that James had heard in cockpits before, and never in good circumstances. James's hand was already moving toward the panel. Number 2, James said. Fire loop. And every part of James Whitfield went cold at once. A cold that had nothing to do with the temperature outside, and everything to do with the fact that he was looking at a warning light on a fire detection loop that a technician nobody knew had replaced 8 days before. A board vote over the deepest and most unforgiving water on Earth at 3 in the morning. Fire. Pete's voice was tight. Do we have a fire? Negative fire. James's hands moved fast and exact, and his voice had gone somewhere flat and very far away. The voice he hadn't used since Afghanistan, the voice that exists in a different place than the rest of a person, a place that doesn't have room for fear. No fire indication. That's a loop fault. That's the detector, not the engine. How do you know? Because the engine's fine. James's eyes went across the gauges in a single sweep that took less than 2 seconds. N1 good. N2 good. Exhaust temps normal. Oil pressure normal. Vibration normal. There's nothing wrong with that engine. What's wrong is the thing that tells us if something's wrong with it. So we've got an engine we can't monitor, Pete said, over the Pacific, at 3 in the morning. James did not say it dramatically. He said it the way you say a fact that needs to be acknowledged before you can deal with it. The checklist said what the checklist said. Pete read it out loud, and his voice only faltered on the second item. Nearest suitable divert was Petropavlovsk, Russia, 210 miles, 800-foot ceilings, with 3/4-mile visibility and blowing snow at an airfield James had never operated into in his life, with an engine he could not monitor. Anchorage was 940 miles behind them. Clear sky. Full maintenance base. A runway long enough to land anything. James sat in the left seat and understood the shape of the thing, all of it completely at once. If he turned for Anchorage, the conservative call the textbook, call the call that every aviation investigator on Earth would review, and nod at Victoria. Caldwell would land in Alaska at 6 in the morning, and lose the Tanaka contract, and lose the board vote, and the memo about egress capability would become part of the permanent record of a company her father built in a garage in Rockford in 1987. And if he pressed on to Tokyo with an engine, he could not monitor over the worst water on Earth, and anything at all went wrong. Then a woman who had already survived one plane crash would be in a second one. And it would be on him. And Maya Whitfield would grow up knowing what her father had traded and what he had traded it for. James Pete said. It was the first time all trip he had used his first name. It's your call. But it's not a hard one. No, James said. It's not. He keyed the intercom. Miss Caldwell, I need you to hear exactly what I'm going to tell you, and I need you not to fill in any blanks. 3 seconds of silence, then her voice perfectly level. Go ahead. We have a fault on a fire detection loop on the number 2 engine. There is no fire. There has never been a fire tonight. The engine is running exactly as it should. What has failed is the sensor that would tell me if something changed. So I am flying an engine I cannot monitor over open ocean at 3 in the morning. Silence. Say the rest, Victoria said. The rest is that I can divert to Anchorage, which is behind us, which has a runway and a maintenance base, and you will not be in Tokyo Monday morning. Or I can continue with an engine I cannot verify for commercial reasons. My recommendation is Anchorage. Why? James Whitfield looked out the windscreen at the black sky over the black water and said the truest sentence of his professional life. Because I don't get to gamble with you, ma'am. Not on a schedule, not on a contract, not on a board vote. That's not what you hired me for, and it's not what I'd tell my daughter I did. The silence that followed lasted long enough that Pete looked at the intercom panel to make sure the connection was still active. Then Victoria Caldwell said, "Go to Anchorage." A pause. That's not me being brave. That's me agreeing with my pilot, which is the entire reason I hired one. They turned at 3:04 in the morning. The turn took 90 seconds, and James flew it without drama. A wide, controlled arc, back toward the east, and Pete called Anchorage Center, and the flight attendant went back to the cabin and sat with Victoria for the entire descent, even though Victoria had not asked her to, and did not particularly need anyone to sit with her, because some things you do for the gesture, and not the need. At 4:52 in the morning, James Whitfield put the Gulfstream down on runway 7, right at Ted Stevens Anchorage International Airport, on the numbers in a 15-knot crosswind, so smoothly and with such precision that the flight attendant would say afterward she genuinely wasn't certain the wheels had touched until she saw the runway lights going past the window. The engine spooled down. The airplane sat still on the Alaskan tarmac in the dark, and James put both hands flat on his thighs and let out a breath he had been holding in one form or another for 106 minutes. Pete Larson was shaking, just his left hand barely visible. He put it under his leg. That was a loop fault, he said. His voice was working at being normal and mostly succeeding. Yeah, that was just a loop fault. We do those in the simulator. Yeah. So why do I feel like this? James looked out the windscreen at the runway lights receding into the Alaskan dark. Because it wasn't the loop, he said. At 5:40, Darnell Cooper called, and his voice was moving fast over a bad connection, the particular fast of a man who has been working through the night and has found something and needs to say it before he loses his nerve. I pulled the paperwork on that loop the second you called me from the air, Darnell said. Part number is right, installation is right, signatures are right. The tech is legit licensed, clean record. I ran him all the way down. But James, a breath. He's been on a monthly retainer from a consulting firm for 11 months, $2,200 a month. James stopped walking. What firm? Meridian Consulting. 3 names and a post office box in Schaumburg. I dug for the ownership 2 layers of holding companies, both filed in Delaware. Another breath, this one slower. The name on the second filing is Howard Greer's son-in-law. James stood absolutely still on the Alaskan tarmac at 5:41 in the morning and felt the architecture of the entire thing assemble itself in his mind, piece by piece, with the terrible clarity of something that has been designed to be understood only at this exact moment, when it was too late for the understanding to help. The work, Darnell said. James, the work is perfect. That's the whole point. Best loop installation I've ever seen. That kid torqued every clamp to spec and then added 2 more. It's a better installation than the factory original. His voice dropped. You install a fire loop that tight, it doesn't fail. It doesn't break. It gets sensitive. It reads the airframe cooling at 40,000 feet after 11 hours of cold soaking, and it goes, that might be something. And it throws a caution light at 3 in the morning over water. It was never going to crash the airplane, Darnell said. It was going to scare the airplane. Put a warning light in front of a pilot at the worst possible hour and wait to see what he did with it. Divert, declare an emergency, miss the meeting, write it in the logbook. That's the incident. That's page 13 of the memo. James looked across the ramp at Victoria Caldwell, coming down the lift in the pre-dawn dark 940 miles from where she was supposed to be, $140 million in contract revenue, 3 hours from signing with someone else. Darnell James said quietly, "How many people know what you just told me, you and me? Keep it that way." He hung up. He walked across the ramp. He crouched down when he reached Victoria, because that was what you did. Because getting on a person's level was not about height. It was about respect. It was a thing Diane had taught him, and he had never stopped doing, and he told her everything. Victoria Caldwell went very, very still, and then Thomas's phone lit up in his hand, and the color left his face entirely, and he said, "Miss Caldwell." "It's Eleanor Nash. She says they filed a complaint 20 minutes ago with the FAA." He looked at James. His hand was shaking. "Against you." Eleanor Nash was on speaker within 30 seconds, and she sounded like a woman who has done the math already and has spent the last 20 minutes sitting with how much she hates the answer. Victoria Eleanor said, "Is he there?" "He's here, Mr. Whitfield. Don't say anything to anyone, not to the FAA field office, not to the safety officer, not to your co-pilot, not to a reporter. Not a word." "I want to answer it," James said. "I know. That's why I'm telling you not to." She exhaled. "The complaint alleges you departed Chicago with knowledge of an unresolved maintenance issue on Engine 2 and continued into known adverse weather over the Pacific. They're saying you knew the loop was compromised and flew anyway. That's the opposite of what happened." James said, "I diverted 940 miles to avoid exactly what they're accusing me of. I know. The flight data is going to show that. Clearly, completely. But it's going to take 11 weeks to show it. That's the point." A pause. "You're a contractor. You fly under Caldwell's operating certificate. The moment there's an open safety complaint on the pilot in command, the insurer's position changes, and the operator's risk committee has a written obligation to review the pilot assignment. Which means Howard Greer doesn't have to fire you. He just has to ask a question in a room." The silence on the ramp was very complete. "Temporarily reassigned pending resolution," James said. 4 words. "And then Victoria has no pilot for the 10th time." "That's page 14, Eleanor said. It's a table. 9 pilots who left, and 1 who got a complaint filed on him. And Greer stands up in front of 6 people and says he's not questioning anyone's ability. He's simply noting that in 14 months, the chief executive's aircraft has been through 10 pilots. Doesn't that suggest something structural in the arrangement?" "And the word in the title of the memo is continuity," James said. "Command continuity," Eleanor said. "Yes. The complaint was filed at 9:06 Chicago time, Mr. Whitfield." James looked at Thomas. "We landed at 4:52. That's 8:52 Chicago." "Yes. Someone filed a 1,400-word safety complaint 14 minutes after the wheels touched." "They wrote it Tuesday," Victoria said. Her voice was very quiet. "They wrote it Tuesday and left a blank where the outcome goes." The ramp was cold and dark and completely still, except for the distant sound of a ground vehicle moving somewhere on the far end of the field. Victoria Eleanor said, "The Tanaka meeting is in 3 hours." "I know. And Greer's 6th vote is contingent on what happens in that meeting." "I know, Eleanor. I need you to make a call." Victoria Caldwell looked out across the Alaskan tarmac for a long moment, at the aircraft she had been carried to over water, with an engine no one could watch, at the man who had turned it around at the dark, beyond the runway lights, where the Alaskan mountains were invisible against the sky. "Thomas," she said. "What time is it in Tokyo?" Thomas checked. 10:57 at night. "Sunday. Get me Kenji Tanaka." Thomas's face went through several things at once. "Ma'am, it's 11 at night. He's at home. He's 71 years old." "Thomas." She turned and looked at her assistant. and Thomas stopped talking mid-breath in the particular way that people stop talking when Victoria Caldwell decided something was finished being discussed. 2 years ago, that man sat in my hospital room in Denver for 40 minutes and did not say one word about my legs. He talked about my father. He is the only person who did. She paused. I have his home number under his wife's name because she gave it to me herself. Get me Kenji. Kenji Tanaka answered the phone in his home in the Setagaya ward of Tokyo at 11:04 at night, and when Victoria switched to English, so James could hear her voice was steady and direct and entirely without performance. Kenji, I'm not in Tokyo. My aircraft had a fault over the Pacific, and my pilot made the correct call and brought us down safely in Anchorage, Alaska. I will not be in your conference room at 9 in the morning. James could not hear the other side. He watched Victoria's face instead. No, she said. I'm not asking you to move the meeting. I'm asking you to keep it. At 9 exactly as scheduled. And I'm asking you to let my pilot brief your engineers on what happened and why he turned around. She paused. Because you're not buying a contract from me, Kenji. You're buying 11 years of aviation systems from a company that has done business with your family since my father was alive. And in 4 days, 6 people are going to vote on whether I'm capable of running it. The argument they're making is that when something goes wrong on my aircraft, I'm the reason it goes wrong. Her voice did not rise. Something went wrong on my aircraft 8 hours ago. I would like your engineers, the best avionics minds in Asia, to hear exactly what happened and decide for themselves whose judgment they're evaluating. A very long silence on the line. Then a voice, and Victoria closed her eyes for 1 full second. Thank you, she said. She hung up. Thomas said in barely a voice. What did he say? He said Victoria replied that my father would have gone to Alaska too. James turned away toward the aircraft. He needed exactly 2 seconds to get his face under control, and he needed to spend them somewhere he was not being watched. He spent them looking at the engine 2 pylon in the pre-dawn dark at the fire loop that had been installed with such flawless precision that it had done exactly and only what it was built to do. He called home at 6:40. Mrs. Hutchins answered, and he heard cartoons playing in the background, and something in his chest that had been braced for 19 hours let go a fraction of an inch. She's fine, Mrs. Hutchins said before he could ask. Eating cereal on the couch, which I know you don't normally allow, but I allowed it. Thank you, Mrs. Hutchins. There was a man here, she said. Last night. Around 8. Rang the bell. Said he was from the company. Very polite. Good coat. Every part of James went cold. Did you let him in? Do I look like I let strangers in? Mrs. Hutchins said with a dignity that could have stopped traffic. I told him you were flying. He said he knew. He said he just wanted to leave a card. She paused. It's on your counter. Should I read it? Please. Says Meridian Consulting and a name. And then he wrote on the back. Mr. Whitfield, when you get home, I'd like 15 minutes. No downside for you here. James stood on the Alaskan ramp and felt something he had not felt in 14 months. Clean, cold, structural rage, the kind that doesn't make you loud. The kind that makes you extremely precise. Mrs. Hutchins, he said. Is the deadbolt on? Bolt on, it's been on since he left, she said quietly. Don't answer the door until I'm home, James said. Take Maya to her soccer game and come straight back. He hung up, stood still for a moment, breathing the cold Alaskan air. At 1 in the afternoon Anchorage time, James Whitfield sat down in front of a borrowed laptop in a borrowed conference room with a bad chair and briefed 7 Japanese engineers on the worst 106 minutes of his professional life. He did it without adjectives, without editorializing in the flat language of someone stating facts and letting the facts do the work. At 02:48, Chicago time at flight level 410, we received a master caution on the number 2 engine fire detection loop. No fire indication. All engine parameters nominal, and they remained nominal for the duration of the flight. He laid out the fuel numbers, the weather, the divert analysis, Petropavlovsk, at 210 miles with 800-foot ceilings and blowing snow, and an airfield he'd never operated into Anchorage at 940 with full support. Dr. Sato, the chief engineer, removed his reading glasses and set them on the table. "Captain Whitfield," he said carefully, "the fuel load. You had 4,000 pounds above what your route required." "Why?" James looked at the camera. "Because 9 days ago I sat at my kitchen table and I could not make the flight work with the legal minimum. Legal fuel would have been fine under normal circumstances. But I had a feeling in my stomach that I could not explain to anyone and could not put in a document. So I loaded 4,000 extra pounds and ate the performance cost, and I told no one why, because I had no reason to give." I had a feeling. The room in Tokyo was silent. Dr. Sato looked at the other engineers. Then he looked back at the camera, and his expression had changed. "Miss Caldwell," he said, "is this man your pilot or your employee, Victoria, just out of frame?" "He's my pilot." Dr. Sato put his glasses back on. "Then I have one question for this room." He looked at the engineers beside him. "Sterling Aero has offered us a fire detection architecture for the Tanaka 400 series. In 4 days, 6 people will vote on whether the woman who signed that proposal is capable of running the company that builds it. This morning, that architecture threw a false alarm over the Pacific Ocean at 3 a.m., and the pilot who could not verify his engine chose to fly 900 miles backward rather than 3 hours forward. And the woman who signed the offer told him to do it." He paused. "I am an engineer. I do not care about votes. I care that when the system lied, the people did not." At 1:40 in the afternoon Anchorage time, Tanaka Heavy Industries signed not for $140 million, but for $165 million over 9 years, with a joint development clause on fire detection architecture that Eleanor Nash would later say on a phone call from her kitchen in Winnetka was the most valuable 11 lines of contract language in the company's history. Thomas sat down on the floor of the FBO conference room with his back against the wall and his head in his hands. James stood at the window and did not celebrate because he was doing arithmetic. "It doesn't fix it," he said. Victoria looked at him. "What the contract doesn't fix, Thursday." James turned. "They'll say you got lucky. They'll say a customer felt sorry for you. And on Thursday, they'll still put a table on a screen with 10 names on it, and mine will have a complaint beside it." Victoria was quiet for a long time. "Yes," she said. "They will." James got home Monday morning after 19 hours of commercial flights, a connection in Seattle, and the specific indignity of middle-seat coach after spending 3 months in the left seat of a Gulfstream. Maya hit him at roughly the speed of sound the moment he came through the door, and he caught her and held on for several seconds longer than was structurally necessary. "You were in Alaska," she said into his shoulder. "I was in Alaska. Were there bears? I was on a runway bug." "Runways have bears," Maya said with total authority. "There's always bears in Alaska." James laughed a real one from the bottom of him, the first real laugh in 3 days, and had to set her down before his arms gave out. The Meridian card was on the counter where Mrs. Hutchins had left it. James read it 4 times. Then he picked up his phone and called the number on the front, and a man answered on the second ring. Pleasant practiced the particular pleasantness of someone who has done this conversation many times and knows exactly how it goes. "Mr. Whitfield," the man said. "Thank you for calling. My name is Frank Weston." "You came to my house," James said. "My 6-year-old daughter was inside." A pause. Something shifted in Weston's voice. "That's fair," he said. "I apologize. That was out of line. What do you want 15 minutes to explain an opportunity? Explain it on the phone." Another pause. "There's a corporate flight department in Denver. Solid operation, real aircraft. They need a chief pilot. $215,000 a year, home 5 nights a week, and a signing arrangement that would resolve the FAA matter, because a settlement makes a complaint disappear, and everybody moves on with their lives. He paused. All you'd need to do is resign from your current position. Today. Cite family. Nobody questions a widower with a 6-year-old citing family, Mr. Whitfield. Nobody. James stood in his kitchen and said nothing. How many of the other 9 did you call? He said. Finally. The silence on the line lasted exactly 3 seconds and told him everything he needed to know. 6, Frank Weston said. James sat down in his kitchen chair, actually sat down at his own kitchen table at 8:20 on a Monday morning with Maya's cereal bowl 3 feet away and a card from a post office box in Schaumburg in his hand. 6 of the 9, he said. They didn't quit. They took better jobs. Every one legitimate, Weston said. Real salaries. Nobody was hurt. 6 good pilots got better careers. 1 company got a talking point, and no one, not one person, was harmed. If you want to be angry about that, I understand. But I'd ask you to notice that it's the least harmful way anyone has ever done something like this. Least harmful, James said. Nobody put a bomb on a plane, Weston said, and he said it with the tiredness of a man who has made peace with a sentence a long time ago. Nobody sabotaged an engine. 6 men got promoted to better jobs, closer to their families. James closed his eyes. 9 pilots. 9 men Victoria had watched walk out the door of her life one by one over 14 months, and every single one of them she had believed in the quiet and private part of herself. She never showed anyone had left because of her. 2 years of that. Mr. Weston, James said. Does she know? Does Victoria Caldwell know that 6 of the pilots who left her were paid to leave? A long pause. No, Frank Weston said. Maya was standing in the kitchen doorway. Socks. Her small stuffed bear hanging from one hand by the ear, watching him with her mother's serious brown eyes. James stood up. Mr. Weston, I'm going to tell you the same thing I told my daughter last week when she asked if I was scared. I told her a little. And she told me that Victoria isn't scared when I'm flying. He looked at Maya. You want to know why I'm not taking your job? It's not principle. It's not honor. It's not any of the things you're bracing for. It's that I have a daughter who's going to ask me at dinner tonight how work was. And I am not going to lie to her in my own kitchen for $215,000. Mr. Whitfield, there is no version of this where you win. Probably not, James said. But she thinks 9 men left because of her. And I'm the only person alive who knows they didn't. And if I take your money, she never finds out. He paused. That's the point, Mr. Weston. There isn't another one. He hung up. Maya said, Are you going to quit? No. Good, she said, and went to get her bear a seat at the breakfast table. And that was the entire conversation. And it was the easiest decision James Whitfield had ever made. James called Eleanor Nash at 8:41, and Eleanor said, He called you before James could speak, which was not a question. How did you know? Because he called pilot number 7 in October. Eleanor said, and pilot number 4 last spring, and I have known about it for 11 months and have not been able to prove one word of it. Not one sentence. Her voice was tight in a way that James had not heard from her. Mr. Whitfield, what did he offer? $215 in Denver, and the complaint disappears by Friday. Did you record the call? Toi. Eleanor said a word that James had not expected to hear from a general counsel with 25 years of experience. Then Mr. Whitfield. He told you a number. 6, James said. He said 6 of the 9 took the deal. The silence on the line was so complete that James checked the screen to confirm the call was still connected. Say that again, Eleanor said. 6 of the 9 pilots who left Victoria Caldwell were paid to leave by Meridian Consulting, which is owned 2 layers down by Howard Greer's son-in-law. He told me that. At 8:20 this morning, in my kitchen, he said it to me directly. He said it to you, Eleanor said slowly, because you are a contractor with no corporate counsel, no recording, no institutional standing, and no reason anyone would believe you over a board member. He said it because he calculated it was safe. A pause. But Mr. Whitfield, I have all 9 names. I have their contracts, their exit dates, their forwarding information. I have had them for 11 months and have never had one single reason to call any of them. Her voice changed. You've given me one. The vote is Thursday, James said. It's Monday. Then we should start with the ones in the Central Time Zone, Eleanor said. At 11:12 on a Monday morning, James called Wade Briggs in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Pilot number 7. 58 years old, 26,000 hours currently flying a Falcon for an energy company. The phone rang 4 times before a man answered, and the 11-second pause after James said his name was its own complete sentence. I've got nothing to say about any of that. Wade Briggs said. I know James said. I'm not calling to argue or accuse. I'm calling because a man named Frank Weston told me this morning that 6 of the 9 pilots who left Victoria Caldwell were paid to leave. And I'm calling to ask if you were one of them. And I want you to know before you answer that I don't care about the money. You took a better job most people would have. And I'm not calling to make you feel bad about anything. Silence. Then how's she doing? James closed his eyes for a second because there it was. Not defensiveness, not denial, but that the first thing. How's she doing? Not good, James said. There's a board vote Thursday. There's a 12-page memo with her name on it, and a table on page 14. 10 names on the table, 9 pilots, and 1 complaint. The argument is that the pattern is her, that she's the reason. He paused. She doesn't know about the 6 Wade. She's watched 9 men walk out in 14 months, and not one of them ever gave her a reason she believed. And she's been carrying what she decided that meant for 2 years. The line was quiet for a long time. Then Wade Briggs said in a voice that had gone rough somewhere in the last 30 seconds, I flew her 11 times. 11 trips. He stopped. You know what she did on the second one Denver weather shut down. I told her we'd sit for an hour. She said fine, and she didn't say another word about it. First executive I ever flew who didn't ask me to try anyway. Another pause. They called me in October. Man in a good coat, Falcon seat in Tulsa home every night. My mother is 84 years old, James. She has dementia. I've been flying out of Chicago for 3 years. His voice cracked slightly in the place where things crack, when a person is holding something they've been holding too long. He said nobody would ever question a man going home for his mother. And he was right. Nobody did. He stopped. You're telling me she thinks I left because of the chair. I'm telling you, she's watched 9 men leave, James said, and nobody ever gave her a reason she believed. And she built her understanding of herself on top of what that meant, for 2 years. Wade Briggs was silent for nearly 30 seconds. Then give me the lawyer's number. By 2:40 that afternoon, Eleanor Nash called James back, and she sounded winded, which was something James had not thought Eleanor Nash was physically capable of. 4, she said. 4 affidavits, and Wade Briggs called 2 of the others himself. I didn't tell him to do that. He just started doing it. The 4th affidavit came through a man named Doug Calloway in Scottsdale, which was not expected. Doug Calloway was pilot number 3, the one who had made the remark about tempting fate on the ramp 14 months ago. The one Victoria had fired on the spot in front of the crew, the one she had carried around in her head for 2 years, as proof that the thing she was afraid of was true. He had not been recruited. He had called Eleanor himself 20 minutes before James's call to Wade Briggs even completed, because he had heard through a connection James would never fully trace that something was happening, and he wanted to say what he needed to say before the moment passed. When Eleanor got him on speaker, Victoria and James both in the room, now late Tuesday night, Eleanor's laptop open on the table. Doug Calloway spent 3 minutes being defensive in the way people are defensive when they know exactly what they're being defensive about, and then 90 seconds being something entirely different. "I'm not walking back what I said," Calloway said. "It was the worst thing I've ever said to anyone, and she fired me, and she was absolutely right to. I'm not calling to revisit that." "Then why are you calling?" Eleanor said. "Because someone from a firm called Meridian Consulting contacted me," Calloway said. 2 weeks before I said what I said. And they didn't offer me a job." Eleanor's hands went completely still on the keyboard. "They took me to lunch," Calloway said. "Nice man, nice coat. He asked me questions. Whether boarding took extra time, whether I'd ever worried about evacuation, whether I'd thought about what I would do if we had to get off the aircraft quickly." He stopped. Then I said no. I said I hadn't thought about it. And he said, "Really never." And then he said, "Huh." Just that. And then he paid for the check, and I never heard from him again. James said nothing. He was looking at the wall. 2 weeks later, Calloway said, "I'm standing on a ramp, and it's in my head. It just got in there, and I couldn't get it out. And I opened my mouth, and I said the worst sentence of my life to a woman who had never done one thing to me except pay me fairly, and on time." His voice had changed completely. "Send me whatever I have to sign." After the call ended, the room was quiet for a long time. Then Victoria spoke in a voice that was very quiet. "He didn't pay that one." Eleanor looked at her. "What?" "He didn't have to pay Doug Calloway. He just asked him a question twice and then waited." Victoria looked at the table. "He paid 6 men to leave. He only had to talk to one. And the one he talked to said it out loud on a ramp where I could hear it, and I fired him in front of the entire crew, and for 2 years I've been carrying that man around in my head as proof." Proof of what Eleanor said. That the other 9 were thinking it too, Victoria said, and just didn't say it out loud. James stood by the window at nearly midnight and understood fully what he was dealing with. He had met Howard Greer's handshake, his warmth, his chin up. He had never met the man who had figured out that you don't need to plant a prejudice in someone from scratch. You just need to hand them a question at exactly the right moment and let them build it themselves in the privacy of their own mind, where no one can call it what it is. The next morning, James drove downtown at 6:15. Eleanor was already in the building with 3 associates and too much coffee. By 4 in the afternoon, they had 7 sworn statements, 6 settlement agreements, the Delaware Incorporation filings for Meridian Consulting, and the maintenance work order for Engine 2, signed by a technician who, when Eleanor's associate called him, had gone silent for 40 seconds, and then asked for a lawyer, which Eleanor noted was in its own way a statement. Darnell Cooper came downtown in a jacket with grease on the cuff and sat in a leather boardroom chair that clearly confused him, looking around the room with the expression of a man who has spent 25 years specifically not being in rooms like this one. "You want me to say all that out loud in front of the board?" he said. "Yes," Eleanor said. "I'm a ramp guy." "You're the man who noticed," Eleanor said. Darnell looked at his hands for a long moment. "Yeah," he said. "Okay." James Whitfield drove to the Caldwell Aero Systems building on Tuesday evening, took the elevator to the 14th floor, and found Victoria at her desk, with the lights half off and the look of a woman who had been working for 11 hours and had a specific number of hours left before she stopped being able to work effectively and was tracking that number closely. She looked up when he came in. "You're not on the schedule." "No, ma'am." "Then why are you here?" James crossed the room and sat down in the chair across from her desk, which he had never done, not in 9 weeks. 9 pilots, he said. Something happened to Victoria's face, quick and small, the first unguarded thing he had seen from her in 9 weeks. "Don't," she said. "6 of them were paid," James said. His voice did not shake. "They didn't quit because of you. They didn't quit because of your schedule or your chair or anything they ever said. They were offered better jobs by a firm called Meridian Consulting Legitimate Jobs. Real money, and every one of them took it. And every one of them believed it was a coincidence because it was designed to look like one." Victoria did not move. Meridian Consulting is owned 2 layers down by Howard Greer's son-in-law, James said. "His representative called me Monday morning and offered me $215,000 in Denver and told me the complaint against my license would be resolved by Friday if I resigned today and cited family." He held her gaze. "I said no. Wade Briggs is giving a statement. So are 3 others. Eleanor has 4 signed affidavits as of this afternoon, and Wade is still making calls on his own. Nobody asked him to." "Why?" Victoria said. Her voice had gone somewhere he had never heard it go. "Because I told them what you'd been thinking," James said quietly. "I told them you'd watched 9 men walk out in 14 months, and nobody ever gave you a reason you believed." Victoria Caldwell put one hand flat on her desk. It was the first uncontrolled movement James had ever seen her make in 9 weeks, and it was very small. And it said everything. "Wade Briggs went to Eleanor in about 90 seconds after I told him that James said. Victoria Caldwell, who had run a $2 billion aerospace company from a wheelchair for 2 years, who had sat in a boardroom in London and heard a 12-page memo built to humiliate her, and said 4 words, and said them right, who had told her pilot to turn around over the Pacific and lose $140 million, and had not for 1 single second made him feel the weight of that decision, put her hand over her mouth. James looked at the window, then at the wall, then at anything that was not her face, because there are things you do not watch a person go through, because the watching itself is a kind of intrusion, because Diane had taught him that the kindest thing you can give someone in the particular second when they are falling is the dignity of not being observed. It lasted about 8 seconds. Then Victoria Caldwell took her hand down. Her face was wet, and she did not comment on it, and she did not apologize for it. 2 years, she said. I got on that airplane thinking. She stopped. I told myself it was the schedule. I made myself believe it was the schedule because the other thing was, she didn't finish. I know, James said. You don't. No, James agreed. I don't. Victoria laughed, broken in the middle. Then she picked up her phone. Thomas, get Eleanor Nash. Get her here. I don't care what time it is. She looked at James. Thursday. When Greer calls that vote, he's going to put a table on a screen with 10 names on it. Yes, ma'am. Victoria Caldwell put both hands on the arms of her chair, straight and deliberate, the posture she used when she was making something final. Then let's give him the 10th name, she said. Eleanor Nash arrived at 7:40 that night, with a rolling bag, a laptop, and the particular expression of a woman who has canceled something. She was genuinely looking forward to, and fully intends to never mention it. 4 affidavits, she said before she was fully through the door. And I need you to hear that Brian Alcott cried on the phone with me for 9 minutes. I need you to know that Victoria was quiet for a moment. Brian flew me out of the hospital in Denver, she said. I know, Eleanor said. He said he's thought about you every week for 2 years and couldn't figure out why a job he got promoted out of made him feel so bad. She set her bag down. Now he knows. Eleanor ran the operation from a conference room on the 12th floor, and it ran the way Eleanor Nash ran things, which was with complete preparedness and an absolute minimum of unnecessary motion. By 4 in the afternoon on Wednesday, there were 7 sworn statements, 6 settlement agreements, the full chain of corporate filings tracing Meridian Consulting back to its Delaware holding company, and from there to Howard Greer's son-in-law and the maintenance work order from a contract technician in Wheeling, who had, upon being reached by phone, remained silent for 40 seconds, and then requested a lawyer. That silence is its own statement, Eleanor told the room. Darnell Cooper sat in a leather chair that clearly had not been manufactured with him in mind, and looked at the 9 people around the table with the evaluating patience of a man who has spent 25 years learning to read a situation from the outside. He did not look comfortable. He did not look uncomfortable. He looked like a man who had decided that something needed to be done and was here to do it. "You want me to say all of that in front of the board," he said, again as if confirming a flight plan. "Yes," Eleanor said, out loud. "In that room. In that room." Darnell looked at his hands, which were clean, but bore the permanent slight darkening that comes from 25 years of working around aircraft fuel and hydraulic fluid. "Yeah," he said. "Okay." At 11 on Wednesday morning, the risk committee met. It took 19 minutes. James found out from Thomas, who called from a hallway sounding like he'd been running. "They reassigned you," Thomas said. "Effective immediately. Pending resolution of the FAA complaint." "That's what Eleanor said would happen," James said. "Mr. Whitfield, they did it. They did it on Wednesday instead of Monday, which means we had 2 extra days," James said. "That's not a setback. That's a schedule we ran ahead of." A pause. "She wants you at the meeting tomorrow. I'm not her pilot anymore. I'm a grounded contractor with an open safety complaint. If I walk into that boardroom, Greer is going to point at me before I open my mouth and say that the 10th name came to defend himself, and everything I say is going to sound like a man protecting his own license. She knows that." "Then why?" she said. Thomas stopped, looked at the words on his screen, that if you're not in the room, then the whole thing is her talking about you. And she spent 2 years having people talk about her. James stood in his kitchen and said nothing for a long moment. Maya was at the kitchen table behind him, drawing something with her crayons, feet swinging entirely absorbed. "What time?" James said. That evening, James crouched down to Maya's level in the hallway outside her room. She was in her pajamas, the small bear in her arms, looking at him with those eyes. "Is something happening tomorrow, Daddy?" He had thought about how to explain it. He had run through 6 different versions in his head. In the end, he said, "You know how sometimes there are people who do unfair things to someone, and then other people have to go to a room and tell the truth about it, so it gets fixed." Maya considered this, like when Tyler said Marcus broke the window and he didn't, and the teacher had to figure out who was telling the truth. Exactly like that. Maya nodded slowly. "Is tomorrow the day with the mean people?" James looked at his daughter. "Yeah," he said. "Tomorrow's the day with the mean people." "Are you going to be okay?" He thought about saying yes. He looked at her and said, "I don't know." Maya did not get upset. This was the thing about Maya. She had been told the truth about hard things since she was 4.5 years old, and she had developed as a result the particular steady calm of a child who knows that in this house nobody was going to hand her a comfortable lie to hold. "Okay," she said, and she hugged him around the neck with everything she had the way she always did, her whole body weight, and no concern for his spine. "Fly safe, Daddy," she said. It was the same thing she always said. At 9:52 in the morning on Thursday, James Whitfield walked into a boardroom on the 16th floor of Caldwell Aerosystems headquarters, in a suit that fit him correctly, but that carried none of the authority of a uniform, and 11 people turned to look at him with 11 different versions of the same expression, which was what is the pilot doing here. Howard Greer smiled. "Mr. Whitfield, I didn't realize you were joining us." Miss Caldwell asked me. Of course she did. Greer adjusted his cufflink, chin up. At 10 o'clock, Howard Greer stood and presented his case, and he was very good. James had known he would be. He did not raise his voice. He did not gesture dramatically. He thanked Victoria twice in the opening 90 seconds, and both times the thanks were genuine and specific and landed exactly the way he intended them to land. He spent 4 minutes on Raymond Caldwell and the garage in Rockford, where the company began, and by the time he finished those 4 minutes, half the faces in the room had softened in a way that had nothing to do with logic, and everything to do with the fact that a good story about a dead man, told with the right kind of warmth, reaches something in people that an argument simply cannot. Then he put the table on the screen. 10 names. He stood with his hands at his sides, and he said with practiced sadness, "I want to be very clear about something, because I know how this can appear, and I need it on the record. I am not questioning Victoria Caldwell's competence or her ability. Nobody at this table is. Victoria is the most capable person in this room, and I have said so publicly on more than one occasion." He let that sit for a moment. "What I am questioning is continuity. 10 pilots, 14 months, 9 departures, and 1 reassignment pending a federal safety review. I'm not qualified to say why. I simply note that this rate of turnover in any other department of this company would concern us all, and I would be failing in my responsibility to this board if I did not ask the room to look at it honestly." He sat down, and the room was quiet for 4 seconds, and James understood in those 4 seconds the specific genius of what the man had done. He had not said one thing that could be quoted against him. He had not made one accusation that could be disputed. He had simply placed 10 names in front of 6 people and allowed those 6 people to do what people do, which was to draw conclusions in the privacy of their own minds, where no one could challenge them. Eleanor Victoria said. Eleanor Nash stood up, and she presented the 7 affidavits and the settlement agreements and the Meridian Consulting corporate filings and the name on the Delaware Holding Company in the particular order and cadence of a lawyer who has built something to be unassailable. And the room made the small sound that rooms make when a floor moves, and someone at the far end said quite audibly, Jesus Harold and Greer's face did not change at all, which was its own kind of confirmation. Darnell Cooper spoke for 6 minutes about a fire detection loop. He stumbled twice. He gripped the arms of his chair during the hard parts. He was without question the most credible person in the room all morning, because he was the only one who was clearly there, because he thought it was right, and not because he had calculated an advantage. Then Greer stood for the second time, and he did what skilled people do when they have been caught. He converted it. Suppose I did all of it. Suppose every word of it. The pilot still left. The turnover still happened. The complaint is still open. And for 11 weeks, the chief executive of this company has no dedicated pilot. I'm not asking you to blame Victoria for any of this. I'm asking you to notice that the situation exists regardless of how it was created. Half the table was nodding. Victoria, she said. Mr. Whitfield. James stood up. Greer said immediately, You have no standing here. You're not on the certificate. He's the 10th name on your table, Victoria said. You put him on a screen in front of 11 people, Harold. He gets to talk. Nobody objected. James put his hands on the back of the chair and looked at 11 people who did not particularly want to be looking at him. I'm not going to talk about the flight, he said. The flight data says what it says, and it'll take 11 weeks to say it, and I don't need this room to believe me about it today. He paused. I'm going to talk about 3 o'clock in the morning over the Pacific Ocean. He told them. He told them about the loop fault and the 2 options, and about what was at stake for Victoria on either side of that decision. He told them about asking her, and about the 4 seconds, and about what she said. I've flown for 8 years in the Air Force, and 11,000 hours since James said. I have never, not in a squadron, not in a cockpit, not in a war zone, had a principal on board who took a pilot's recommendation in 4 seconds when that recommendation cost them everything they'd been working for. He looked around the table. You're not voting on whether she can exit an aircraft. You're voting on whether the man who spent 2 years making her believe she was the problem should get to present that damage as evidence. He looked at Howard Greer. His voice did not rise. Mr. Greer, 14 months ago you took a pilot named Doug Calloway to lunch. You asked him how difficult it was to fly for Miss Caldwell. He said it wasn't difficult at all. He let that sit. And you said, and he will say this under oath, that's disappointing. The room was very quiet. I have one question, Sir James said. It's not a legal question and you don't have to answer it. He held Greer's gaze. What were you hoping he'd say? Howard Greer opened his mouth. 4 seconds, 5, 6, 11 people watched a man who had spoken in that room for 22 years sit with his mouth open and produce for the first time in any of their memories absolutely nothing. A board member named Constance Park, 9 years on the board, never once voted against Greer on anything. Consequential said I'd like to move that we table the operational risk review permanently and open a formal investigation into Meridian Consulting. Second, someone said. It carried 8-3. Howard Greer resigned that afternoon at 2:40 in a letter of 109 words. The word sorry did not appear in any of them. The investigation took 4 months and found exactly what it was always going to find, because Eleanor Nash had built it the way James built a fuel load, with more than was strictly required in case the coin came up wrong. Greer's son-in-law settled. Frank Weston's firm dissolved. 2 other board members went with them quietly the way people go when they are guilty of enough to be nervous, but not enough to be prosecuted. The FAA complaint resolved in 7 weeks. Not 11-7, because the flight data was precisely as James had said. It would be an aircraft that turned 940 miles backward in the middle of the night, with a loop fault and 4,000 pounds of fuel nobody had required the pilot to carry. The investigator who closed the file was a career FAA man named Ray Holland, and he called James personally, which was not standard procedure. That fuel load, he said. Nobody made you do that. No, sir. Why'd you do it? James thought about how to answer. Had a feeling, he said. Ray Holland laughed. Not admissible, you know. I know. It's in my report anyway. Page 6. My supervisor asked me to take it out and I said no. A pause. Fly safe, Captain Whitfield. James went back to work. Victoria went back to work. The rhythm between them settled into what it had been before the morning briefings. The weather calls the coffee that got progressively worse at hour 8, except that something had shifted underneath it, the way something shifts under the earth, when the pressure that's been building releases and the ground above looks the same, but holds differently. Maya's birthday came in October. There were 11 kids, a sheet cake, and a bounce house that James had rented for 4 hours and would find traces of in his backyard for the better part of a year. Victoria arrived at 2 o'clock in her everyday chair in a dark green jacket, and Sophie introduced her to every child at the party with tremendous formality as my dad's boss, and she runs the whole company, which produced a range of reactions depending on the child, but universally resulted in the question of whether her wheels were faster than a bike. Not faster than a bike, Victoria said to the 4th child, asking. Faster than a scooter. Depends on the scooter. Faster than Maya's dad. Your dad's slow, said Victoria Caldwell, and 4 7-year-olds collapsed with laughter. James stood at the grill and watched it, and Mrs. Hutchins came and stood beside him, and they watched together for a while. That's the CEO, Mrs. Hutchins said. That's the CEO. Mrs. Hutchins was quiet for a moment. She's laughing. Yeah, real laughing. Mrs. Hutchins patted his arm once. Diane would have liked her. James looked at the yacht, at its daughter spinning in circles in the grass, at Victoria Caldwell, laughing with her head back in a way he had not seen her laugh once in 9 weeks of flying her across the country and across an ocean. Yeah, he said. she would have, and it did not hurt the way it would have hurt a year ago. It hurt the way weather hurts present familiar something you have learned the shape of. You dress for it. You go outside anyway. At the end of the evening after the last child had gone home, and Maya had fallen asleep on the couch with her shoes still on, James walked Victoria to the driveway. She told him something then, and she said it the way she said things she meant, which was without hedging or softening or asking him whether he was ready to hear it. "I didn't hire you because you were the best pilot who applied," she said. "You weren't. Number 2 had more hours. Number 5 had more type ratings. You were the 10th best resume Gerald Patton had shown me in 14 months. James said nothing. "I hired you because you were the only one of the 10 who asked me a question about my job," she said. Every one of those men walked into my office and saw the chair and started working around it, managing it, being careful about it, but before I'd said one word. You sat down and asked me if any of the 9 had ever given me a reason I believed. She held his gaze. Nobody had ever asked me that, Mr. Whitfield. In 2 years. She started toward her car. Then she stopped. "Tokyo's in 3 weeks, she said. "I'll be there. Weather's going to be bad. Then I'll put extra fuel on." Victoria Caldwell laughed a real one out loud in a driveway in Chicago at 10 o'clock at night. "Good night, James." It was the first time she had used his first name. "Good night, Victoria," he said. He went inside. He picked Maya up off the couch, shoes and all, and carried her down the hall, and she woke halfway and said something about cake. "Tomorrow, Bug," he said. "Promise," she said. "Promise," he said. He tucked her in. He stood in the doorway the way he stood in it, every night watching his daughter breathe in the dark, and he thought about 9 pilots and 6 payments, and 1 question asked at a lunch table to a man who had never been able to get it out of his head again. And he thought about Maya at 31,000 feet saying she's not scared so you don't have to be. And he thought that was probably the most important piece of aviation wisdom he had ever received, and that it had come from a 6-year-old who still slept with a stuffed bear. He turned off the light. He went to bed. Tomorrow he had somewhere to be. In November, Maya drew a picture at school of an airplane flying above a line of clouds, the kind of drawing that 6-year-olds make, where the proportions are approximate, and the sky is a band of blue crayon at the top, and everything below it is white space. She labeled the airplane with 2 words in large, careful letters, her father's name, and beneath it the word, safe. Her teacher framed it and gave it to James at pickup, and James put it on the dashboard of his truck on the same side as the photo of Diane he kept in the sun visor, and one morning in December, he realized that both of them, the photo and the drawing, were facing the same direction. And he sat in his truck in the school parking lot for a minute, with the engine running, and said nothing to anyone, and then drove to the airport. That spring, Victoria Caldwell delivered the keynote address at the Aviation Leadership Forum in Washington, D.C., speaking without notes for 22 minutes to a room of 400 people who had expected a prepared speech and received something else. The specific authority of a person who has survived something designed to be unsurvivable and has decided clearly and without bitterness that the experience belongs to her and not to the people who engineered it. At the end, she said one sentence that was quoted in trade publications and legal briefs, and later in the preamble of a new federal guidance document on executive transport standards. The only thing that ever kept this company in the air was people who refused to believe the ceiling was as low as someone else decided it should be. She accepted the standing ovation that followed with her hands flat on the arms of her chair, which was how she had always accepted the things that mattered most. In the Caldwell Aero Systems flight records filed under routine documentation in a cabinet on the 2nd floor, there is a fuel log from a Saturday in October, handwritten, the margins filled with calculations done in pencil at a kitchen table at 1 in the morning while the 6-year-old slept down the hall. The numbers show 4,000 pounds above the legal minimum with no explanation in any official column. No notation, no paperwork justifying the decision. Just the numbers themselves and the arithmetic beside them, showing how the pilot made them work despite the cost. And at the bottom of the page, in the same pencil, the single word Anchorage with a circle around it, written 9 days before Anchorage was ever needed. Every pilot who has reviewed that log since has understood without being told what it means, and understood without being asked why it matters, and not one of them has ever explained it to anyone, because some decisions don't live in the paperwork. They live in the kind of person you decide to be before anyone is watching at a kitchen table at 1 in the morning with a chart of the Pacific Ocean, and a feeling you can't defend, and a daughter asleep 12 feet away who believes you will get it right. If this story moved you, if James's quiet courage reminded you of someone you know, or Victoria's strength reflected something you've carried yourself, we'd be grateful if you'd share it.